Chapter 698. This little girl was not simple. She was really not simple at all. Rome, you had never seen an ordinary person with such tenacious willpower. He had also seen those souls that were forcefully assembled into pieces. One of them was even a tough man who had been on the battlefield for a long time. After his soul was made into that shape, he screamed like a pig being slaughtered. It was simply heart-wrenching. Without stopping for a moment, Rome had also used a similar array to clean up that person's soul. As a result, during the process, that person did not cooperate at all. When he was asked to go up to the east, he leaned to the west. When he was asked to stretch his arm, he stretched his leg, and in the red light, he rushed left and right like a madman. Even his most trusted concubine couldn't wake him up. Just slightly straighten his arm, and he screamed like a madman. Rome Tianlan's ears suffered greatly. From then on, Rome Tianlan did not do this kind of work to clean up people's souls. He was really traumatized. The reason why he was sitting here this time was, firstly, because the ancestor ordered him, and he was embarrassed to refuse. Secondly, there was also a little bit of guilt in his heart. After all, it was because he helped Ning Xuemore treat her leg that this accident happened. Rome Tianlan had always been thick-skinned and did not like to take the responsibility on himself. But, this time, he felt that he was a little responsible. This time, when he came in, he was already prepared to let his ears suffer again. After all, the other party was a little girl. The little girl was more delicate, and her voice was sharp. When the time came for treatment, her screams would definitely break through the house, but he did not expect that Ning Xuemore's reaction was completely beyond his expectations. She rarely screamed. Before Kirin came in, she rolled a lot. But after Kirin came in, she only had a trace of consciousness, but she could completely follow the instructions. In the process of cleaning up and correcting, she was clearly in so much pain that she was trembling in pain, but she could still endure it. At most, she could only moan twice. She was even tougher than a tough man. No one didn't admire the strong, not to mention the other party was a delicate little girl. This girl could always give people too many surprises. It was no wonder that a person like the ancestor also looked at this girl differently. This girl really had the ability to make a 10,000-year-old iron tree bloom. 2 hours passed, and then another 2 hours passed. As the night passed, the sky began to brighten. The sun rose from the east and gradually moved to the center of the sky. Then, it slowly set in the west, leaving behind a half-bright and half-dark rosy glow that dyed the sky. One day. An entire day. This treatment lasted for an entire day. When half of the blood-red liquid in the cauldron was consumed, Ning Xuemore's soul finally returned to its original appearance. She was probably exhausted to the extreme. The moment she recovered, she closed her eyes and fell asleep. Rome Tianlan was also tired. He felt that all the bones in his body were about to fall apart. He wanted to find a place to sleep. He couldn't help but glance at Di Zun again. This time, Di Zun was in charge of the treatment, so he would only be more tired. Moreover, he had just used the earth shrinking technique and the 1,000 miles in a breath technique. Now, the old man was able to sit there without fainting. That was already very impressive. Ning Xuemore's soul had been placed back into her body. Rome Tianlan watched as the girl gradually regained her breath. Her face gradually turned red. This meant that it was very successful. They had successfully saved the girl who was on the verge of death. Chapter 699. As long as she had a good night's sleep, she would be able to wake up the next morning. After 3 to 5 days of rest, she would be as lively as before. Di's were, "Do you want to take a rest? I'll take care of things here." Rome Tianlan felt that the ancestor's face was a little pale. He was afraid that the ancestor would be worried, so he added, "Don't worry, I won't leave before you come back. Even if this girl wakes up and stabs me with a knife, I won't leave." The ancestor sat there without speaking, as if he was troubled by something. He looked out of the window, lost in thought. Di's were, "Do you have something on your mind?" Rome Tianlan was keenly aware of the ancestor's abnormality. The ancestor's most common expression was expressionless, indifferent, and indifferent. It was very difficult to see any emotion on his face. Rome Tianlan had known him for so long, but he had never seen him lose his mind. A person like him was too strong, and there were very few things in this world that he couldn't solve. No matter what sort of troublesome matter occurred, he was always able to make arrangements in an orderly manner. It was fine if he didn't make a move, but when he did, it would definitely be like a bolt of lightning that swept through everything in an all-powerful manner. There was utterly no one capable of resisting his sharpness. When the matter was solved, it naturally wouldn't become a worry for him. Today, Ning Xuemore had clearly been rescued, and she would wake up tomorrow at the latest. So where did the ancestor's worry come from? It was very rare for the ancestor to show such an expression. Rongyue Tianlan was concerned, and his gossipy mood began to burn. The ancestor's eyes swept over Rongyue Tianlan. He pondered for a moment, then suddenly asked, "Rongyue, you can be considered a playboy. You should be able to understand a woman's thoughts, right?" How rare. The ancestor, who didn't touch the secular world, actually began to pay attention to a woman's thoughts. Rongyue Tianlan took out his folding fan, opened it, and waved it coquettishly. He said rather reservedly, "I know a little. Why don't you tell me what's difficult for the ancestor?" The ancestor pondered for a moment. There was a woman who was in danger. She heard that her husband was going to save her, so she tried her best to stall for time, waiting for her husband to save her. In the end, her husband didn't save her because he was a little unhappy. Instead, he went to the tea house to drink a few cups of tea and missed the best time to save her. Let her fall into the enemy's hands and suffer. Will this woman forgive her husband easily? Rongyue Tianlan, he blurted out, is her husband sick? His wife is in danger, yet he still has the heart to drink tea. After seeing Di Zuo's unfriendly expression, Rongyu finally reacted and carefully asked, "Ancestor, may I ask why her husband went to the tea house to drink tea?" As the saying goes, saving a soldier is like putting out a fire. Di Zuo, what are you trying to do? You were clearly in a hurry when you left, and you even used forbidden techniques in succession. Why was he drinking tea when he was almost there? This didn't make any sense. The ancestor glanced at him and said, "Don't worry about these minor details. I just want to ask you, if this woman knows about this matter, will she forgive you easily? Emperor's throne, this is the main branch, okay? How was this a minor detail?" Alright, it would be difficult to get the truth out of Di Zuo's mouth. He decided not to ask. Rongyue Tianlan looked at Ning Xuemore lying there and then looked at the ancestor. "Di Zuo, do you want me to tell you the truth?" Chapter 700. Nonsense. Di Zun replied straightforwardly. Rongyue Tianlan shook his fan and sighed, "It's difficult. A woman's mind is very sharp. If she knows the truth, she will completely fall out with her husband. Well, the degree of falling out will be proportional to how much she has suffered." Di Zun's thin lips were slightly pursed, and his face was even worse. Rongyue Tianlan thought for a moment and comforted him. However, if her husband knows his mistake after this, and goes to his wife's room to beg for forgiveness, kowtow a few more times, and coax her with soft words for a period of time, she might forgive him. Women are more fickle and easily moved. Seeing her husband's sincere repentance, she may forgive him. Di Zun frowned even more. Ask for forgiveness? Kowtow? He felt his hair stand on end just thinking about it. This won't do, think of a more reliable one. Di Zun's eyes were bright as he looked at Rongyue Tianlan. Rongyue Tianlan almost scratched his head. He had offended her so much. He didn't even want to ask for forgiveness. He coughed, if her husband can't put down his face, he can slowly reform her. For example, he can give her peaches today and clothes tomorrow. After a long time, she will slowly be reformed. She doesn't care about these. Di Zun simply cut off his words. This girl actually has a lot of money. Naturally, she can buy whatever she wants. How can she be interested in such trivial things? You call yourself a playboy. Can't you think of a more reliable one? Rongyue Tianlan also became ruthless. There is another way. It is said that it is very effective. It is a magic weapon that some men use every time. Di Zun's eyes lit up slightly. Tell me. Rongyue Tianlan coughed and opened his mouth. It seemed that it was difficult to speak. But under Di Zun's gaze, he could only say, some women like strong men. No matter how much a man offends her, as long as the man subdues her and then drags her to bed. After doing it for a while, under normal circumstances, the woman's anger will dissipate. Di Zun. This works. Is there something wrong with the man or the woman? He looked at Rong Yue Tianlan. Have you tried this method? Rong Yue Tianlan touched his nose. How can such an elegant man like me do such a beastly thing? Di Zun looked at him with an unkind gaze. He knew that it was a beastly thing, yet he still wanted him to do it. Rong Yue Tianlan thought of a few more ideas, but they were all rejected by the ancestor. He knew Ning Xuemo's temper, and these were not suitable. In the end, Rong Yue Tianlan was also helpless. He spread out his hands and said, "Then it's better to beat her until she loses her memory and forgets these things." He was just saying it in a fit of pique. Unexpectedly, the ancestor's eyes lit up slightly. He finally stood up and said, "You finally came up with a reliable idea." Rong Yue Tianlan was dumbstruck as he looked at Di's were rolling up his sleeves. He couldn't help but reach out his fan and hook it on the ancestor's sleeve. Di's were, "You don't really want to hit her, do you? She's actually quite weak. She probably won't be able to take a hit from you." The ancestor flicked his sleeve and flicked the fan away. He said indifferently, "How can this venerable be so violent? I have other ways to make her forget all the unpleasant things." Rong Yue Tianlan. He watched as the ancestor walked over and used a spell to erase the woman's memory. Chapter 701. Di's were, "Your method is also very simple and crude, okay? Moreover, if a person's memory is repeatedly erased, she will feel a little confused, and some things can't be connected. You can't erase too much. Di's were, maybe she doesn't know that you went to the tea house to drink tea, so she won't blame you." Rong Yue Tianlan struggled to say, "Take it easy." The ancestor said indifferently, "She must have heard my conversation with Kirin. Otherwise, she wouldn't have rejected me so much during the treatment." This was the first time he came into contact with such matters, so he wasn't sure. However, his deductive ability was not ordinary. When he connected the dots between Ning Xuemo's attitude towards him, he immediately understood what was going on. Rong Yue Tianlan was speechless. "So, that Kirin's memory has to be erased again?" The ancestor didn't say anything, so he naturally agreed. Since he had the intention to do something, he naturally wouldn't leave any future troubles for himself. Rong Yue Tianlan waved his fan and didn't say anything. Once the ancestor decided on something, even 10 immortals couldn't change it. He could only light a candle for Ning Xuemo in his heart. Being loved by a man like the ancestor, he really didn't know whether it was her fortune or misfortune. Di's were, "Now that you've returned to the Sun-Moon sect, will you interact with her as Han Shanyu or as the ancestor?" This was what Rong Yue Tianlan was most concerned about. The ancestor slightly frowned and said indifferently, "You don't have to worry about this." His eyes swept over Ning Xuemo. She didn't seem to have any real feelings for Han Shanyu. She always rejected being his concubine and always thought that she was a shield. This wasn't a good start. Maybe he should erase Han Shanyu from her memory? However, the time that Han Shanyu had been with her wasn't short, so he had a lot of memories. If he erased them all at once, Ning Xuemo's memory would be damaged. Moreover, Han Shanyu was the identity that he often used in the lower bound. He still had to use this identity to do some things. He couldn't let this name disappear. He looked down and began to think of a way to satisfy both sides. After all, Rong Yue Tianlan had known him for many years and understood the ancestor's temperament quite well. Looking at his expression, he had the impulse to light a candle for Ning Xuemo again. The little girl was indeed very smart, but she was up against an ancestor who had lived for thousands of years, experienced countless storms, and calmed countless storms. She was obviously not his match. It hurts. Ning Xuemo, who had been sleeping all this time, suddenly murmured. It was a very low sentence, but it made the two men present turn their heads at the same time. On the white jade couch, Ning Xuemo's thin brows were slightly furrowed. She seemed to be in pain. The overlord, who was standing in front of the window with Rong Yu and Tianlan, appeared in front of the white jade bed in the blink of an eye. He sat beside her and picked up one of her wrists to check her pulse. Rong Yu Tianlan was still worried and walked over. "How is it? Why does it still hurt?" Di Zun put down Ning Shuamore's hand and said indifferently, "It's not really painful. It's just that she has been in pain for too long, so it's become a kind of subconscious pain." Romeo Tianlan nodded and felt relieved. He had a good impression of this little girl and didn't want her to suffer any more. Di Zun glanced at him and seemed a little strange. "Why are you still here?" Romeo Tianlan was speechless. Di Zue, "You're too quick to burn the bridge after crossing the river." He tapped the space between his eyebrows with his fan, and was about to bid farewell when Chapter 703. So. Romeo Tianlan raised his eyebrows. "So I'll just sit on her body. I can't let Shuemore's lies go to waste." Romeo Tianlan was completely speechless. Well, when the Overlord's bad taste came up, even the gods couldn't stop him. "Little girl, you're on your own." There was a vast and misty lake. The shore was paved with jade cobblestones, and there was a waterside pavilion in the lake. The pavilion was made of tortoiseshell, and the walls were made of green jade. It looked like a crystal palace in the lake. A coral path led to the waterside pavilion. A man in white stepped on the coral path and floated over. Before he arrived, a disciple of the Sun-Moon sect rushed out and bowed to the ground. "Overlord." The Overlord nodded slightly and asked, "How is he?" The disciple respectfully said, "I've already given him the best medicine. His injuries are fine, and his physical strength has also recovered. He has already woken up." The Overlord nodded and strode in. The disciple naturally waited outside. He was sent by the Overlord to take care of the Sharkmen. Without the Overlord's order, he wouldn't leave without permission. On the glass couch in the waterside pavilion, Yi Feng reclined there with his eyes closed, as if he was sleeping. His beautiful fishtail flapped gently, flashing a faint blue light in the pearl light. The door gently creaked, and he immediately became alert. He opened his eyes, and the moment he saw who it was, he immediately sat up straight, crossed his arms, and saluted. This was the highest salute of the merman race. "Ancestor." The Overlord nodded slightly and glanced at him. "You've lost 650 years of power." Yi Feng was stunned, and a touch of admiration flashed through his eyes. He bowed his head. The Overlord has a good eye. His judgment was not wrong at all. He was plotted against by Xue Yilan on the ship that day. He was poisoned and lost 500 years of power, so he could no longer maintain his human form and could only appear in the form of a mermaid. As for Yi Qingwan, his shoulder blade was pierced by her, and coupled with the desperate escape, he lost a lot of vitality. He had also lost more than 100 years of psychokinesis. Right now, Yi Feng had to stay close to the water. Otherwise, the scales on his body would dry up and he would feel uncomfortable. Even his breathing would become dry. Not only that, he had to soak in the water every 2 hours. Otherwise, his body wouldn't be able to take it. "Why don't you return to the sea?" The ancestor looked down at him, the white jade mask on his face glittering. Yi Feng froze, unable to answer. Yes, he had already become like this. Even if Yang Ziyuan didn't marry that Jiyu Xian, it would be impossible for him and her to be together. Even simply staying by her side had become an extravagant hope. He should have returned to the sea, to his own race. But he couldn't bear to. If he left, he would never have the chance to see her again. He was clearly in despair, but he was still unwilling to leave. He was unwilling to leave just like that. She hadn't even tasted the fish that he had grilled with his own hands. "Thoughts in my heart?" The ancestor asked again. Yi Feng lowered his eyes and answered with one word, "Yes." "She is not fated to be with you in this life." The ancestor's voice was as cold as ever, but also cold. Yi Feng's eyelashes trembled slightly, and he said indifferently, "This little one knows." When he forcibly used the forbidden technique to keep Yi Yu's soul and help her reincarnate, he knew this day would come. The reason why the forbidden technique was called a forbidden technique was that it required a variety of sacrifices. Some needed blood, some needed life, some needed lifespan, and some needed fate. Yi Feng had lost his fate with Yi Yu in this life. Chapter 704. No matter what Yi Feng did, Yi Yu would never fall in love with him. Yi Yu's lover would always be someone else, Since you know, why can't you let it go? The ancestor sat down on a chair beside him. He looked like he was going to have a long talk. Of course, the chair had been cleaned by him with the cleaning spell. It was cleaner than washing it with alcohol. Yifeng paused for a moment. I just want to see her well. He just wanted to silently protect her and see her happy. But even he couldn't do that. He lowered his eyes sadly. A jade-like palm appeared in front of Yifeng. There was a red fruit in the palm. It was as moist as a coral bean. It was the size of an apricot. It shone faintly. Yifeng knew what it was. He suddenly raised his head and looked at the fruit. Then, he looked at the ancestor. His voice trembled slightly. Ancestor, this was the red light fruit. It was a divine fruit that could only be found by chance. It could strengthen the spiritual power of the people of the Water Tribe for 300 years. It was a treasure that the people of the Water Tribe dreamed of. This fruit was much more precious to shark men than the 1,000-year Ganoderma and 1,000-year ginseng. As long as he absorbed this fruit, he could regain his human form and his identity as Yifeng. This fruit was priceless. Not only did the ancestor save him, but he also gave him such a precious fruit. Yifeng had always been calm. At this moment, he was like a miser who was suddenly hit in the head by a big gold ingot. He was a little confused and couldn't believe it. The ancestor didn't bother to answer his nonsense. He threw the fruit to him. This is all I can do for you. Yifeng solemnly put away the fruit. He took a deep breath and bowed to the ancestor again. Thank you for your kindness. If the ancestor needs anything in the future, Yifeng will not hesitate to go through water and tread on fire. The ancestor stood up and said indifferently, it was Ning Xuemore who wanted to save you. You can consider this favor to her. He turned around and left. Yifeng paused for a moment. Ancestor, I wonder if I can leave the Sun-Moon sect for a few days. The ancestor's footsteps didn't stop as he said indifferently, you can leave at any time. The Sun-Moon sect has no intention of keeping you here. At first, Yifeng thought that the ancestor had saved him because there was a shortage of mermaids on the continent. He thought that the ancestor would force him to stay on the mountain. She didn't expect that. He really just wanted to save her once. If that was the case, once he recovered, he could go and do his own things. The ancestor didn't like to meddle in other people's business, and the whole continent knew that. His willingness to help this time was an unexpected surprise. Who on earth was Ning Xuemore? She was able to make the ancestor make an exception for her. Yifeng took another deep breath, and Ning Xuemore's figure flashed through his mind. He secretly made up his mind that he would find a way to repay Ning Xuemore in the future, and repay this enormous favor. Ning Xuemore sat on the bed in a daze. To be honest, she was a little confused. She was sitting on a strange wooden bed with a soft bedding that was as light as a cloud. The light blue bed curtains were layered and flowed like water. There was a pond of green lotuses painted on the curtains. When she moved them, it was as if she was stirring a pond of spring waves. The green leaves in the water and the lotus flowers flowed in the wind. The scenery was extremely beautiful. She didn't know what material the bed curtains were made of, but they were as light as clouds and as thin as gauze. When she touched them, it was slightly warm and smooth, as if it could melt in the palm of her hand and become a pool of blue water. Ning Xuemore sat on the bed and looked around. She felt like she was sitting on a boat surrounded by lotus ponds. There was even a faint lotus fragrance in the air. It was very light, but it seeped into her heart. Ning Xuemore raised her hand to touch the bed curtains, and then touched the bedding below her. This place looked simple, but it was extremely low-key and luxurious. Chapter 705. Ning Xuemore had never laid on such a comfortable bed in her life. She had never seen such a picturesque bed curtain. Even the palace might not have this kind of bed curtain, right? She had never seen this kind of material in the presidential suite of the modern era. How did she end up sleeping here? What was this place? She rubbed her eyebrows and tried her best to think. The past events came back to her mind. She was turned into a cat by Yi Qingwan and escaped with Yifeng. They escaped and escaped, but in the end, they couldn't escape from that woman's pursuit. She and Yifeng were captured, and then Then she was tortured by Yi Qingwan in all kinds of ways, living a life worse than death. Her last impression was that woman carried her to a big cauldron. The oil in the cauldron was boiling, and that woman said she was going to put her in the oil. Then she had no impression of it at all. The only feeling she had was the pain that penetrated her bone marrow and the overwhelming redness. Did she die again? Did she possess the body of some noble lady again? Otherwise, how could she escape from the hands of that perverted woman? And sleep on such a good bed? Ning Xuemore touched her face subconsciously. It was warm and smooth, and her skin was very young. She looked at her hands again. Her eyes lit up. Her small hands were white and tender, her nails were pink, slender like jade, and tender like spring onions. This was clearly her former hand. Could it be that she had returned to her own body? She lifted the quilt without a word, opened the gauze curtain, jumped off the bed and looked at herself in front of the dressing mirror. The girl in the mirror had black hair covering her forehead. Her eyebrows were curved, her eyelashes were long, her eyes were big, and her mouth was small. It was her former appearance. Not a single bit off. Ha ha ha, she was actually back. She was back in her own body. She seemed to have thought of something and hurriedly lifted her skirt to look at her feet. That pair of bare feet stepped on the wooden floor. They were slender like a crescent bow, white like crystal, and pink like pearls. They were round and cute. Her feet had also recovered. Rongyue Tianlan's method was really effective. He really healed her feet. Ning Xuemore was overjoyed. She stood on the spot and turned in a circle. Her yellow skirt fluttered in the wind, like flowers blooming in the spring. After being happy for a while, another question surfaced in his mind. She remembered that before her body entered the mud shell, she was wearing a set of special clothes from head to toe. That set of clothes looked like a bell worn by monks. But it was effective, so that her body would not be injured. Now that she had recovered, who was the one who put this light yellow dress on her? She vaguely felt that there were no maids in Rongyu's residence, only a small servant. She checked the dress she was wearing. The material of the dress was excellent. It was as smooth as water and very comfortable to wear. The embroidery on it was exquisite and the size was quite suitable. It was as if it was specially made for him. Coupled with her hairstyle, she looked indescribably cute and lively. This outfit matched her temperament very well. Ning Xuemore smiled at the mirror, and the girl in the mirror smiled back at her. She was stunningly beautiful. She raised her hand and touched her face. She seemed to have become more tender. After soaking in the hot spring, she looked like she was 18 years old. But now, she looked like a 15-year-old girl. Her skin was so tender that it seemed like water would come out with a pinch. Her body couldn't have shrunk, right? She lowered her head and looked at her chest. It was still handsome and tall, with a slender waist. This figure was simply too devilish. Chapter 706. Lolita face, devilish figure. This was the most realistic portrayal of her now. Ning Xuemore was satisfied. At this time, she finally had the heart to look at the furnishings around her. The screen, the flower rack, the table, the cauldron that emitted a delicate fragrance, every single one of them was quaint and exquisite, which was pleasing to the eye. This kind of room was not something that ordinary people could afford to live in. Was this still Rongyue Tianlan's island? The sunlight shone in through the window, bringing with it a slight warmth, jumping in the room, jumping in her palms, making her slightly impetuous heart calm down. Tranquil, serene, and sunny. Ning Xuemore let out a light sigh of relief. It seemed that she had not tasted this kind of peaceful time for a long time. Her expression was absent-minded for a moment, being forced to turn into a cat, running for her life, being captured and tortured, as if it was just a nightmare, waking up and the flowers were still blooming, the sun was even better. That should not be a nightmare, right? It was so specific, so thrilling, it was not something that a nightmare could contain. Moreover, she had never remembered the dreams that she had in her life. But she remembered this very clearly. The scenes at that time could be replayed in her mind like a movie. However, she felt that she seemed to have forgotten something, lost something. It seemed like she had forgotten a small episode, but she could not remember what it was exactly. The sound of the flute drifted in, rippling like the spring breeze, with the power to calm people, as if it could heal all the wounds. Ning Xuemor's heart jumped. This flute sound made her heart palpitate for no reason, as if she had heard it many years ago, and was fascinated by it. She put on her shoes and ran out. The scenery in the courtyard made her startled. This courtyard was not big, with white walls and green tiles. There were bamboo and big stones in the courtyard. The layout was ingenious, but it gave her a faint sense of familiarity. The flute sound came from outside the courtyard. The green leaves in the wind flipped and danced with the flute sound. It was already late autumn. The courtyard was slightly cold. Ning Xuemor thought for a moment, then ran back to the house to find a cloak and put it on, then ran out of the courtyard. If she didn't guess wrongly, this flute sound should be played by Rongyue Tianlan, the romantic young master. After all, this was his home. Only someone as talented as him could play such a heart-wrenching flute. Since he had saved him, he ought to go and thank him. At the same time, he could also ask about Yi Feng's whereabouts. It was a completely different world outside the courtyard. The moment Ning Xuemor saw the scenery outside, her heart skipped a beat. The Phoenix Pavilion and the Dragon Tower are connected to the heavens. The jade tree and the jade branches are like the smoke of wisteria. These two lines were a true portrayal of the architecture here. White jade was used as bricks, while green jade was used as tiles. Pavilions, terraces, and towers rose and fell continuously. They were built along the mountainous terrain, as if they could directly reach the heavens. It was grander and more majestic than the imperial palace she had seen before. The imperial palace gave her a feeling of splendor, but this place gave her the feeling of an ancient temple. Holy and solemn. This wasn't what surprised Ning Xuemor, but the layout and style of the building reminded her of a place, the place where Yi Qinghuan of the Bright Reverence sect live. But compared to this place, Yi Qinghuan's place was like a knockoff. The quality of the materials was not as good as here, the size was not as good as here. Her place was like a small building compared to here. With Yi Qinghuan's obsession with the Venerable Di, she should have cloned the place where the Venerable Di lived. She wouldn't have cloned Rongyue Tianlan's island layout. Chapter 707. Could this be the territory of the Sun Moon sect's venerable emperor? Ning Xuemor was startled by her own thoughts. She carefully sized up the layout of this place. Then, she discovered that this place was different from Yi Qinghuan's place. There was an extremely magnificent main hall in front of her, but Yi Qinghuan's place didn't have it. Yi Qinghuan seemed to have turned this side hall into the main hall. She had completely removed the layout of this side hall. Ning Xuemor turned around and looked at the courtyard she had run out of. The more she looked, the more it resembled the main hall of Bright Reverence. A thought flashed through her mind. Could it be that the place she had woken up in was where Yi Qinghuan had once lived? She inexplicably shivered. At this moment, she finally determined that this was the Sun Moon sect. If she wasn't wrong, then the main hall not too far away was where the venerable emperor lived. After Yi Qinghuan was expelled from the Sun Moon sect, she had been unwilling to accept this. Thus, she had simply moved the layout of this side hall over to the venerable emperor. It was as if she hadn't left the Sun Moon sect and was still living in her former courtyard. Ning Xuemor couldn't help but flick her clothes. As if she wanted to flick off the dust from the courtyard, she took a deep breath. She now understood that being captured by Yi Qinghuan last night wasn't a dream. This was the first time she had come to the Sun Moon sect and the first time she had seen the layout of this place. This was also the first time she had gone to Bright Reverence. If she had relied on her imagination alone, it would have been impossible for her to have seen the layout of this place. Her body had originally been at Carefree Island, and her soul had nearly been thrown into a frying pan by Yi Qinghuan. Now that she had woken up, she was actually in the residence of the Sun Moon sect's venerable emperor. Had the venerable emperor arrived at the critical moment and rescued her? The more she thought about it, the more likely this seemed. She simply ran towards the sound of the flute. She ran past the main hall and followed the sound of the flute through a bamboo forest. In the depths of the bamboo forest, she could see the tip of a pagoda. And at the top of the pagoda, she could faintly see a person sitting there. From a bit further away, that person's figure was blurry. Ning Xuemor could only make out the person's fluttering white clothes and fluttering black hair. Ning Xuemore's steps paused for a moment. That person was like a high and mighty emperor. Ning Xuemore had been running around for a long time, but she hadn't seen anyone else, not even a servant girl. If it weren't for the sound of the flute, Ning Xuemore would have suspected that she was the only living person on this mountain. She had vaguely heard from Ji Yunhuang that the ancestor lived alone in the Sun-Moon sect. Apart from his direct disciples, no one was allowed to enter the Heavenly Sound Peak without his permission. Ning Xuemore looked at the person on the top of the tower and paused for a moment. In the end, she still ran over. She ran over and found that the pagoda was not built in the bamboo forest, but on a lonely mountain peak. The mountain was surrounded by steep cliffs and was only connected to the surroundings by a chain. Ning Xuemore felt that this layout was similar to the Demon Ceiling Tower in the Legend of Sword and Fairy. However, the Demon Ceiling Tower in the game was greenish-black and gave people a gloomy feeling. But here, it was a standard white pagoda. The color was like colored glass. The sunlight was refracted by it, as if it had a Buddhist aura. She finally saw the person sitting on the top of the pagoda clearly. A wide white robe, a white jade mask, and long hair as black as night, the standard attire of the ancestor. He held a white jade flute in his hand and played it by his lips. The flute was originally a mournful tune, but when played by him, it was peaceful. It was like a spring drizzle, like a flower blooming in the wind. It made people's restless hearts calm down. Above the top of the pagoda, there were white cranes flying gracefully, as if they were dancing to the flute. Chapter 708. Ning Xuemore seemed to have sensed something. She looked around and saw birds and beasts of all sizes perched on the peaks of the bamboo forest. They were all listening to the music with their heads tilted to one side. They seemed to be very satisfied and absorbed in the music. Ning Xuemore was speechless. She had heard of the story of the flute attracting the phoenix, but she thought it was just a myth. She didn't expect to see the real version. The ancestors' flute attracted countless birds and beasts. They danced and listened attentively. This scene was shocking enough. Ning Xuemore was also shocked by this scene. She stood there in a daze for a while. She felt like she had seen this scene before, but she couldn't remember where. She had a feeling of déjà vu. She simply sat down and hugged her knees as she watched him play. When the song ended, the music lingered in the air. The white-clothed ancestor stood up and looked down at her. He said faintly, "Do you want to play a song with me?" His voice was like an echo in an empty valley. It seemed to carry a misty cloud and a faint fragrance of the Queen of the Night. It was unbelievably pleasant to hear. Ning Xuemore looked up at him. In theory, this should be the second time she met the ancestor. The first time was in Chang Kong Country's imperial palace. She was almost frozen into an ice sculpture by him. The second time was now. Ning Xuemore patted her hands and looked up at him. Xuemore is afraid of the ancestor's love. It's just that Xuemore didn't bring a musical instrument, so I can't play with you. What musical instrument are you good at? The ancestor seemed to be very talkative. Ning Xuemore thought for a moment. Pipa. She was actually best at the zither, but because of Shuer Ilan, she had a shadow over the zither. The ancestor's eyes flickered slightly. He waved his sleeve and a purple light flashed in front of Ning Xuemore. A pipa appeared on a big rock in front of her. Naturally, the things given by the ancestor were the rarest treasures in the world. Ning Xuemore picked up the pipa and looked at it. It was a jade pipa. From the large surface of the jade pipa to the small shaft that held the strings tightly, everything was so perfect. Compared to the pipa that Ning Xuemore had played in the palace, it was much better than the Milky Way. Holding such a precious pipa, Ning Xuemore had the urge to cut her nails. He was afraid that if he used too much force, he would leave a scratch on it and destroy this perfection. Di Zun looked at her. "What do you want to play?" She had to choose. Ning Xuemore said, "Di Zun, please go first. Xuemore will follow." The ancestor glanced at her again. Her attitude was respectful and courteous, natural and unrestrained. There was nothing wrong with it. However, the ancestor's eyes faintly deepened. He just nodded. "Okay, you follow." The flute sounded again. Ning Shuamore's fingers that were holding the peeper tightened. She suddenly looked up at him. The white-clothed ancestor lowered his eyes. He was playing the same peeper song that she had played at the banquet in Chong Kong country. What did he mean by playing this song at this time? Ning Shuamore's mood suddenly became chaotic. She faintly felt that something was different. Di Zun was a smart person. Naturally, he wouldn't forget where he had heard this song. Now, he was playing it in front of her. Was he trying to confess his identity? Follow. The ancestor's voice floated in her mind. She looked up and saw the ancestor looking at her. She couldn't see the color of his eyes clearly from the distance. She only faintly felt that his gaze was glued to her body. This feeling made Ning Shuamore's heart beat faster. Chapter 709. Ning Shuamore began to play the flute. Her mood was slightly disturbed, so the sound of the peeper she played wasn't as perfect as it used to be. The ancestor seemed to have sensed her absent-mindedness, so he played her peeper a few times, but to no avail. Ning Shuamore played a few wrong beats, so the noise naturally didn't attract the birds and beasts, so they all dispersed. When the flute stopped, Ning Shuamore also stopped. She was a little embarrassed, and she didn't know why, but she had an impulse to run away. She could sense that the ancestor in white was watching her from the top of the tower, as if he was studying her. Being stared at by him like this, Ning Shuamore only felt her scalp faintly numb. She did not know what he was plotting. She coughed and said, "Shuamore came here to thank the ancestor." "Thank me for what?" "Thank you for saving my life, ancestor. You and I must be so polite." The ancestor's voice came faintly. Ning Shuamore smiled faintly and said, "I'm not being polite, this is what I should do." The ancestor on the top of the tower didn't speak for a moment. The mountain wind blew between the white tower and the mountain, making a whistling sound. The ancestor didn't speak again, and Ning Shuamore also didn't speak. There was a moment of silence. If it weren't for the mountain wind blowing and the occasional bird chirping in the distance, Ning Shuamore could almost hear her own breathing and heartbeat. This kind of atmosphere made people feel a little uneasy, so Ning Shuamore's first thought was to retreat. She raised her head and smiled. "Ancestor, Shuamore still has one more thing to ask. Go ahead." "There was a friend who was in danger with me. I don't know if he—" Ning Shuamore thought of Yi Feng. The ancestor's eyes deepened slightly. "He is your friend? What kind of friend?" Ning Shuamore faintly furrowed her brows, but she still answered truthfully with only 4 words, "Life and death friends." As the wind blew, the air on the mountaintop seemed even colder. After a moment of silence, the venerable sovereign finally answered, "I've already rescued him." Ning Shuamore's eyes lit up. Yi Feng was indeed saved. She felt as if a large stone had been lifted from her heart. She blurted out, "How is he?" Her concern was obvious. Di Zun. The aura around him became even colder. "He is in the celestial water lake. Since you are so concerned, why don't you go and see him yourself?" Before he could finish his sentence, he paused. Because Ning Shuamore actually turned around and ran away. She did not forget the etiquette she should have before leaving. "Many thanks, Di Zun. I'll go and see him now." His voice soon dissipated in the air. In the blink of an eye, she ran into the bamboo forest and disappeared. She actually abandoned him just like that. Di Zun sat at the top of the white tower, not knowing how to react. As the wind blew, his white robe fluttered, making his figure look slightly desolate and lonely. Didn't Kirin say that before Shuamore was caught by Yi Qingwan, she had something to say to him? Then why didn't she say anything now that she had seen him? Did she forget? That's not right. When I erased her memory, I only erased the conversation between her and Kirin, as well as a small part of her memory. Logically speaking, if she really had something to say to him, she shouldn't have forgotten it. Also, her attitude towards him seemed a bit strange. It seemed that they had become estranged again. He lowered his eyes and looked at his hand. There was a bright red jade hairpin in his palm. The jade hairpin was as red as fireworks. It was carved from a whole piece of red jade. Chapter 710. A flame flower was carved on the hairpin, and each petal was vivid and lifelike. Subconsciously, Di Zun hated the color red, but somehow, he felt that Ning Xuemore was suitable for wearing red. She even said that they should wear red when they got married to show their respect for each other. Therefore, despite his tiredness, he forced himself to find this piece of red jade. He stayed up all night and carefully carved this jade hairpin. He wanted to give it to Xuemore when he saw her again. It would be even better if he could put it in her hair personally. The moment he saw her running over, his heart started to beat faster and he was a little flustered. That was the feeling of happiness. It turned out that this was the feeling of waiting for someone and seeing that person running over. He had never experienced this feeling before, but it was strangely beautiful. He was even looking forward to what she would say to him. But he didn't expect that Xuemore was most concerned about Yifeng besides thanking him. As soon as she heard about Yifeng's whereabouts, she turned around and ran away without any hesitation. His fingers clenched the jade hairpin tightly. He accidentally used a little too much strength, and the jade hairpin made a few soft sounds. It directly broke into several pieces. His fingers stiffened and he slowly opened his palm. Looking at the broken jade hairpin, he frowned slightly. He didn't use any strength, and he didn't even use his psyche power. He just clenched it slightly and it broke into such a state. Ning Xuemore knew that Di Zun lived on Tianyin Peak, so in her impression, Tianyin Peak was a mountaintop, a peak as tall and steep as Jade Maiden Peak. She only needed to run down the peak, but she didn't expect that she couldn't find the way down the peak even after running along the path she took to come here. There were many paths here, but each path was either leading to those buildings or to the bamboo forest, but none of them led to the foot of the mountain. When she ran to the end of the path, she found that there was a vast body of water at the end. It was more like a water wall than a body of water. Looking out, she felt as if she was looking out from an underwater tunnel, and all she could see were ripples. Was this a wizardry barrier? Or was Tianyin Peak really built at the bottom of the sea? If he wanted to leave the peak, he would have to break through the water. Ning Xuemore carefully reached out her hand to touch the water wall. She really touched water. The water was real. There was no barrier, but it did not flow over. The water flows downwards, and here it becomes a bubble. It seemed that if she wanted to leave the mountain to visit Yifeng, she would have to pass through this water wall. The problem was that she didn't know how far this water wall went. If it was too far or too deep, she might drown before she could even surface. Ning Xuemore used to like playing with water, but after being flooded 3 times, she had developed a fear of water. She stood in front of the water wall for a moment. Perhaps, this was the only side with a water wall. The other sides might be the way down the mountain. She turned around and began to look for other routes. Another hour passed, and she returned to the front of the wall of water. There were no other roads. Ning Xuemore used her superior Qinggong and circled around the mountain countless times, but she still couldn't find any other passageway. One was the White Tower at the end of the bamboo forest, and below the White Tower was a vast sea of clouds. The other was this water wall of unknown thickness. Which one was the passageway to go down the mountain? When she returned to the end of the bamboo forest, Di Zun was no longer there. Chapter 7:11. Ning Xuemore also suspected that there was a passage under the sea of clouds, but she couldn't see anything. She threw another stone down, but she didn't hear any sound for a long time. Obviously, the valley was very deep. There were ice bees under her feet. If she jumped down, she might fall into pieces. She couldn't fly, therefore, she could only go back to the water wall. She tried to reach a hand into the water wall. Her whole hand went in. It really felt like entering the water, and it wasn't an illusion. She believed that her whole body could also get into the water wall and then swim out. The premise was that she wouldn't drown. She shuddered slightly, and the water in the wall of water splashed with her. "I'll take you out." A voice sounded behind her. It was quiet and refreshing like a breeze. Ning Xuemore subconsciously turned around and saw the Di Zun standing not far from her. This person really came and went like a ghost. He appeared so close to her, and she didn't even notice until he spoke. She simply smiled and said, "Okay, thank you, Di Zun." She couldn't help but be polite and alienated when talking to him. The Di Zun's eyes slightly deepened. He walked forward and reached out to her. "Give me your hand." His fingers were white and slender, shining faintly under the sunlight. Ning Xuemore paused and said, "I'm sorry for being rude." Then, she reached out and held his wrist. The Di Zun looked down at her hand that was holding his wrist. He asked Xuemore to give him her hand, but she held his wrist instead. There seemed to be no difference, but in fact, it reflected a person's subtle state of mind. If she completely trusted him, she would obediently let him hold her hand and let him take her out. Only if she subconsciously didn't trust him would she directly hold his hand and take the initiative. It turned out that even if he erased that part of her memory, her trust in him was still very low, and she didn't even realize it herself. His heart was slightly bitter and astringent. Suddenly, he pulled her into his arms. She was shocked and cried out. Her hands and feet reacted before her brain. She let go of his hand and subconsciously hit him with her palm. His eyes flashed slightly, and he did not dodge this palm. This palm imprinted itself on his chest. Bang! With a loud thud, he still stood there steadily, unmoving like a mountain. However, a hint of sadness flashed through his eyes. "Are you afraid of me?" Ning Xuemore only reacted after the slap. Perhaps it was because she was too frightened, she had used all of her strength in that slap. Her palm hurt. If it was an ordinary person, her palm strike would have sent them flying. Fortunately, the other party was a venerable emperor, an omnipotent and super powerful venerable emperor. Then wouldn't this slap of hers be like a tickle to him? Ning Xuemore was a little surprised. She herself also felt that her reaction towards the ancestor was somewhat inexplicable, but she just couldn't control herself. She coughed and apologized sincerely, "I'm sorry." The ancestor looked at her quietly for a moment, as if he was enduring something. "There are two ways to get out of here. The first way is for me to bring you out, but I need to carry you. Secondly, I will teach you the water avoidance technique. However, if you practice this technique, you will need at least 3 days to master it. Which way do you choose?" Ning Xuemore hovered in her heart for a moment. She was worried about Yi Feng. If she didn't go and take a look, she wouldn't be at ease. Therefore, no matter what, she had to go out and take a look first. Chapter 7:12. I choose the first option. Then I'll have to trouble you, Di Zun. Di Zun's eyelashes drooped slightly. In such a short period of time, Ning Xuemore had thanked him 3 times. What he lacked the most in his life was other people's gratitude and politeness. He had long been used to it. The only thing he wasn't used to was her. He reached out his hand again. "Give me your hand." Ning Xuemore glanced at him. After all, she had just inexplicably slapped him, so she still felt a little guilty. At this time, she was obedient and put her small hand in his palm. Di Zun held her hand and pulled it slightly into his arms. "Close your eyes." Ning Xuemore remembered that time when she went to Rongyue Tianlan's island because she didn't close her eyes. She decisively closed her eyes. Di Zun's palm slightly tightened, and then she only felt a chill around her. She felt the waves of water around her body. She couldn't help but think of the experience of being drowned in the water. Her body stiffened, and with one hand in his palm, she always had the illusion that he would let go in the next moment. She couldn't help but reach out her other hand to grab his robe sleeve. She only felt that it seemed to be safer if she grabbed it. She didn't expect that she wouldn't be able to catch anything. She only grabbed a handful of water. This time, she was shocked and couldn't help but open her eyes. In front of her, there was a blue wave. There was nothing in the water, only herself. Yes, only herself. She couldn't even see Di Zun, who was holding her hand just now. She was thrown into the water again. Was she going to be drowned again? Great fear attacked her, and she couldn't help but rush forward. "Xuemore!" Someone shouted in her ear. She hurriedly looked back, but she couldn't see anyone. No one saved her. She had to save herself. She didn't care and rushed up even more fiercely. However, the water seemed to be very deep. She desperately swam upward. She felt that she had been swimming for 4 or 5 minutes, but there was still a blue and hopeless water above her head. She was extremely scared. Her whole body trembled, and her hands and feet turned cold in an instant. She wanted to swim upstream again, But she didn't expect that her hands and feet seemed to be trapped by water plants, and she couldn't move at all. Despair. An overwhelming sense of despair filled the air. There was a breath stuck in his chest, and he couldn't spit it out. So depressing. So depressing. So depressing. Who was going to save her? Who was going to save her? Was there still no one to save him? Was he still the only one in this world? Her tears could not help but flow out. She felt her head gradually become dizzy and buzzing. She could no longer breathe. Below the heavenly sound peak of the Buddha Lotus Mountain, there was a huge waterfall that cascaded down. Flying straight down 3,000 feet, like the Milky Way falling from the ninth heaven. Using these two lines to describe the waterfall was the most appropriate. There was a deep pool below the waterfall, and the water in the pool flowed out of the valley, meandering away. There were 8 disciples of the Sun-Moon sect standing solemnly beside the lake. There were 4 men and 4 women, and they were arranged in a fixed formation. All of them stood as straight as javelins. The sound of water splashing could be heard from the waterfall on the mountain peak. A white shadow passed through the waterfall and floated down. The wide white robe was like a winding cloud, and the jade-colored mask shone faintly under the sunlight. Venerable Sovereign, the 8 disciples bowed in unison. The opportunity for the Venerable Sovereign to leave the mountain was extremely rare. Even the disciples guarding the mountain could not see him more than a few times. There were very few outsiders on the heavenly sound peak, so when the disciples saw the iconic white robe in the wind, they subconsciously knelt down to welcome him. Their hearts were so excited that they were pounding. Chapter 7:13. The disciples guarding the peak finally saw Di Zun again. Rise. Di Zun only spat out one word. The disciples stood up, but when they saw Di Zun's figure clearly, their eyes widened in surprise. Di Zun was actually holding a girl in his arms. A girl in a pink and yellow dress. The girl's eyes were slightly closed, and her fine black hair flowed out from Di Zun's arms like satin. She seemed to be in pain, her body trembling, and her eyelashes trembling violently. Her small mouth was tightly closed, as if she was afraid of water entering. Her face was slightly pale. Di Zun landed on the ground, but he didn't look at the disciples. He immediately bent down to look at the girl. Xuemor, Xuemor. He called her over and over again. Ning Xuemor's lips were tightly closed, and her nose was flaring violently. Her small face was pale, but she still refused to breathe. How could this be? In fact, the water wall just now was just this waterfall. He had used a spell to turn it into an endless water wall. People who didn't know how to break in would drown. Those who could enter Tianyin Peak were all his direct disciples, and their cultivation level was above Earth rank level 4. Only then could they learn how to enter. Others couldn't enter at all. Therefore, if Ning Xuemor wanted to come out, he had to personally bring her out. Di Zun had never brought anyone in or out of this barrier since he built it. This was the first time. He had set up the water wall barrier himself, so he naturally knew that it was easy for people to hallucinate inside, so he told her to close her eyes before entering. After entering, he was afraid that she would be afraid, so he held Xuemor in his arms. He thought it would be foolproof, but he didn't expect that as soon as she entered the water wall, her hands would start to scratch wildly. It was obviously a sign of hallucination. He had to bind her hands and feet to prevent her from scratching and moving, and then quickly came out. From entering the water wall to coming out, it took him less than half a minute, but he didn't expect that after carrying her out, she would seem to be suffocating and wouldn't breathe by herself. Her small face slowly turned blue. No matter how he called her, she wouldn't wake up. The omnipotent Di Zun was helpless for the first time. A female disciple at the side also noticed that something was wrong with Ning Xuemor. She mustered up her courage and said, "Ancestor, she seems to be Meng Chen." The ancestor abruptly raised his head. He didn't have the time to ask what dreamy drowning was and went straight to the point. How do you treat it? This. You have to treat her like a drowning person. Turn her over and control the water. If that doesn't work, you have to help her vent her anger. That disciple was quite a character. Although he was still in shock, he could still quickly explain, "This disciple can give it a try." "No need." The ancestor waved his hand. He would treat those who were truly drowning. He quickly flipped Ning Shuamore over so that she was lying on his lap. He pressed his palm against her back and exerted some force. Ning Shuamore finally spat out a mouthful of water. She inhaled very little water, so she stopped after spitting out a mouthful. He turned her over again. Shuamore was lying weakly in his arms. Her small face was still blue and white. She bit her lips and refused to breathe. The ancestor's eyes darkened. Almost without thinking, he lowered his head and pressed his lips against hers. He forcibly pried open her teeth and gave her a mouthful of air. This was obviously a life-saving move. Ning Shuamore's body trembled. Finally, she was able to breathe and choked. The ancestor's hanging heart finally relaxed. He held her in his arms and let her lie on his shoulder. He gently patted her back to help her breathe. "It's all right. Don't be afraid." Chapter 7:14. Ning Shuamore finally regained her senses. She felt as if she was lying in someone's embrace. There was a faint fragrance lingering around her nose. That fragrance was very familiar. Her body stiffened slightly. She finally regained her senses and opened her eyes abruptly. The first thing she saw was a few men and women dressed in the Sun Moon sect's uniform. They were standing not far away. Their faces looked as if they had been struck by lightning. And she was lying in the ancestor's embrace, being patted by him like a child. What kind of strange situation was this? Ning Shuamore felt as if she had been struck by lightning. She struggled violently and finally broke free from the ancestor's embrace. She looked at the ancestor and then looked around. The ancestor slowly stood up. He was wearing a white jade mask, so Ning Shuamore couldn't see his expression clearly. She only felt a pair of extremely dark eyes sizing her up. "You were trapped by the water monster in the dreamland. You're fine now. Ning Shuamore." She finally remembered everything just now. Her body trembled slightly, but she straightened her back and smiled. "I'm sorry, She was an extremely intelligent person. She was also a doctor, so she knew this was a nightmare. Now that she connected the dots, she knew what had happened to her. She clenched her fingers in her sleeves and pursed her thin lips. She had been traumatized by the water. Once one entered the water, it was easy to enter the illusion of drowning. Ning Shuamore was in such a situation. Ning Shuamore's psychological quality was strong, but after all, her soul had been abused. The scene of being drowned in water and unable to survive had been engraved in her bones. She couldn't forget it for a while. "Let's go." The ancestor raised his sleeve and held her cold little hand. "I'll send you to the Celestial Lake Pavilion." He took Shuamore and left, leaving behind the Sun Moon sect's disciples who were almost petrified. They looked at each other in dismay. This was the ancestor? The venerable sovereign that even gods and ghosts couldn't approach? Could it be an imposter? Who was that girl? To actually be treated like this by an emperor, heavens! Even if the sun rose from the west, they might not be so shocked. In front of him was another boundless body of water. In the middle of the body of water was an antique waterside pavilion. A narrow coral-paved path led to the waterside pavilion. Ning Shuamore knew that this was Celestial Lake, and Yi Feng should be in the pavilion. She realized that she seemed to be afraid of water now. The sight of this large body of water made her scalp tingle. She stood by the lake and calmed herself down before taking a deep breath. Di Zun stood beside her and saw that she was not in a hurry to walk on the coral path. Instead, she stood in the same place. Her pretty face was faintly pale, and even her hand that was holding his was cold. "Scared?" he asked in a low voice. Seeing her like this made the ancestor's heart feel like it was being twisted. "Don't be scared. I'll send you there." Di Zun simply held her hand and walked towards the path. It was a path that was not only in name, but also in reality. The entire path was less than a foot wide, and on both sides of the path were rippling waves of the lake. From afar, this path looked more like a red snake winding in the water. In the past, Ning Xuemore naturally didn't care about walking on such a path. Chapter 7:15. In the past, Ning Xuemore wouldn't have cared about walking on such a small path. Even if it was half as narrow, she would still be able to walk steadily without fear. But now, she found out that she was actually afraid of water. Ning Xuemore had never been afraid of anything, but now she was afraid of water. She was afraid from the bottom of her heart. When the ancestor pulled her towards the small path, her legs began to tremble. Unforgivable. Not to mention others, even she herself felt that such a cowardly person was unforgivable. Xuemore was irritated. She threw off the ancestor's hand. No, I'll do it myself. She had to overcome this. She had to become stronger. She had to create her own world on this continent. How could she be afraid of water? She took another deep breath, controlled her trembling legs, and walked towards the coral path. Di Zun stood in the same place, looking at her straight figure. A trace of sadness flashed through his eyes. He looked down at his hand. His palm still had the warmth of her small hand. But when Xuemore threw him off, she didn't hesitate. Trust. What Xuemore lacked the most was trust. When Xuemore was with him, even when he held her hand, he could feel her stiffness and her defense. Moreover, this stiffness and defense was involuntary. It wasn't intentional. It was obvious that it came from the bottom of her heart. It seemed that although her memories had been erased, her soul still hated him, resented him, and despaired of him. So even if she lost her memories, Xuemore's soul still subconsciously remembered this feeling. That was why she was so repulsed by his approach. The ancestor raised his hand and rubbed his forehead. To be honest, he didn't know what to do. This was the first time he felt that things were a bit tricky. This was the first time he had come into contact with such feelings. He was inevitably at a loss. Thinking about it, he remembered the great love Saint Rongyue Tianlan. After Rongyue Tianlan returned to his own carefree island, he fell into a deep sleep. Healing Ning Xuemore's soul consumed too much of his willpower. He felt that his bones were sore and his legs were numb. He needed a good rest to recover. While he was having a good dream, the sound transmission amulet on his body vibrated continuously, waking him up from his dream. He groggily touched the sound transmission amulet and took a look. Half of his drowsiness had disappeared. It was the ancestor's sound transmission. Rongyue Tianlan subconsciously looked at the sky outside. The sun had only risen a pole high. Heavens, wasn't Di Zun the most tired one last night? Shouldn't he be meditating in seclusion? Why did she contact him so early in the morning? Did something happen to Ning Xuemore? He picked up the voice transmission talisman. Emperor's throne? Why would you call me if you need anything? But Miss Ning. The ancestor's cold voice came from the sound-transmitting charm. She's fine. Rongyue Tianlan heaved a sigh of relief. It was good that the little girl was fine. His guilt could finally come to an end. He yawned and asked, Di Zue, why are you contacting me now? There was a moment of silence on the other side, as if he didn't know what to say. It's rare for an ancestor to be so speechless. Rongyue Tianlan's interest was immediately piqued. Emperor's throne? She's afraid of water. She's afraid of me. The ancestor's voice was calm. Rongyue Tianlan, the ancestor had woken him up so early in the morning just for this. Rongyue Tianlan lay down again, his voice weak. Emperor's throne, her soul has just been tormented. If I'm not wrong, she should have been drowned. It's very normal for her to be afraid of water. Chapter 7:16. It's Ning Xuemore. If she were an ordinary girl, she would have gone crazy after experiencing these things. As for you, Di Zue, I'm afraid her soul has remembered the feeling of despair she felt for you. Therefore, she subconsciously doesn't want to rely on you anymore. Her trust in you has decreased. Rongyue Tianlan was indeed a Casanova. He analyzed the girl's psychology clearly and logically. It was rare for the ancestor to listen to him so much, but he didn't say anything. This made Rongyue Tianlan suspect that the ancestor was distracted. Di Zue, are you listening? Of course. The ancestor replied. After a pause, He added, get to the point. Romeo Etiennelan wanted to cry. He endured his sleepiness and said so much. How was it not the point? If someone else said that to him, he would have turned off the sound-transmitting charm and refused to listen. But the ancestor. Alas, forget it. He didn't want to argue with the ancestor. What's the point that you want to hear? What should I do? The ancestor's question sounded like an order. Romeo Etiennelan immediately became excited. The ancestor was asking him for advice on how to pick up girls. Then he had found the right person. He took the fan that never left his side and began to talk with assurance. The ancestor listened to Romeo Etiennelan's unique skill of picking up girls while paying attention to Ning Xuemore. She walked very slowly on the coral path. Although her back was straight, he could see that her legs were still shaking. She should be very scared. But she was also trying to overcome this fear. This girl had always been strong. Although she looked delicate and weak, she had always been conquering others. Of course, she was also conquering herself. There was a splash of water nearby. A big head popped out of the water and shouted happily at Ning Xuemore, Master. It was Kirin. After Ning Xuemore's soul entered her body, it was put down on the Tianyin Peak. The ancestor said that its martial arts were too weak and it needed intensive practice. He directly drove it into the big lake. It had been worried about Ning Xuemore. Now that it suddenly saw her, it was happy and immediately shouted. Kirin's appearance was too sudden, and Ning Xuemore was in a state of high tension. The coral path was narrow, and he was startled by its sudden movement. His body swayed and he fell into the water with a splash. The ancestor was startled for a moment. He was about to rush over and pull her out when Kirin moved quickly and used his body to push her up. It was still puzzled. When did its master become so easily frightened? Ning Xuemore leaned on Kirin's back and couldn't help but grip its horn so tightly that her fingers turned white. Kirin could feel her trembling and was even more surprised. Master, what's wrong? Ning Xuemore's face turned pale. She knew that she shouldn't be afraid, but she couldn't stop herself from trembling. She wanted to reply, I'm fine, but her teeth were chattering. How could she say that? Master! Master! Kirin panicked and hurriedly turned to look at her. A white shadow flashed in front of her. The ancestor directly stepped on the water and came over. He stretched out his hand to Ning Xuemore. Don't be afraid. Come to me. Ning Xuemore leaned on Kirin's back and didn't raise her head. Her wet hair hung down, making it difficult for people to see her face. No, she finally spat out 2 words. Let me be alone. She had to overcome herself. She had to. The ancestor's sleeves stiffened in the air for a long time and slowly drooped down. He said in a low voice, Okay. Remember, I'm by your side. I won't let you get hurt again. It was the first time he had said so much. However, Ning Xuemore didn't respond at all. She acted as if she didn't hear him. The ancestor slightly lowered his eyes and had to return to the coral path by himself. Chapter 717. Kirin didn't know what had happened. It looked around blankly. Who could tell it what had happened? Why did its master become like this? It could feel that its master was afraid of water, so it tried to comfort her. Master, don't be afraid. The water is very good. It's very comfortable to stay in it. Master, you used to be able to swim, and you can swim very well. She knew. She knew all of this. She understood. However, she couldn't control the fear of water that came from the depths of her soul. This fear made her angry with herself, disappointed with herself. Her hands and feet were trembling, especially her feet that were still in the water. They seemed to be cramping, and even the tips of her feet were stiff. She leaned on Kirin's back and didn't get up for a long time. Di Zun stood there and looked at her trembling body. He saw her shoulders trembling slightly, and his heart felt as if it was drowning. Was she crying? This girl who was always smiling and unyielding at all times was crying? Just because she couldn't overcome her fear of water? Di Zun clenched his fists so tightly that his fingertips turned white. If he hadn't delayed that life-saving 4 hours, Things wouldn't have turned out like this. This was the first time he had encountered such a situation. He didn't know how to deal with it. How could he break the knot in her heart? Miss Ning. A calm voice sounded from the waterside pavilion. Yi Feng walked out. Ning Xuemo's body stiffened slightly. She naturally recognized Yi Feng's voice. She took a deep breath and slowly raised her body. Her fingers brushed her wet hair. There were still traces of water on her face. It was unknown whether it was the water droplets that fell into the water or the tears that she had just cried. While brushing her hair, she wiped her eyes and looked at Yi Feng. She was stunned for a moment. Yi Feng had regained his human appearance. He was wearing black clothes and had black hair. His facial features were well-defined, and he was handsome and neat. Although he was a man of few words, he was very observant. He had seen Ning Xuemo repeatedly drowned by Yi Qingwan. He knew her not, so he could understand her current behavior. Just now, he was meditating to recover. When he heard movement and opened his eyes to look outside, Ning Xuemo had already walked onto the coral path. Yi Feng had already seen that she was afraid, but he could not go out at that time. No one was willing to let their friends see them at their most embarrassing moment, especially those who were strong-willed. He wanted to wait for Ning Xuemo to walk over with a strong will. Then, he could talk to her as if nothing had happened and say goodbye to her. He did not expect her to fall into the water. The moment she fell into the water, he almost rushed out. Fortunately, Kirin was smart enough to save her immediately. Chapter 718. Because he was wearing a mask, no one could see his face clearly. However, Yi Feng felt a sense of loneliness and desolation from him. Yi Feng briefly explained how he was rescued. Ning Xuemo was happy for him. Now that he had returned to his human form, wouldn't he have a chance with Yang Ziyuan again? One of them stood on the coral road, while the other sat on the back of the Chiline. They chatted for a while. Perhaps it was because the conversation was relaxing, or perhaps it was because the conversation diverted her attention. Ning Xuemo was finally not so nervous. Her feet no longer trembled in the water, and she slowly relaxed. However, she still subconsciously held the Chiline horn, not daring to loosen it. Yi Feng saw the changes in her. He pondered for a while and asked tentatively, "Miss Ning, I have also just turned into a human. I want to try the taste of swimming in the water again. I wonder if I can accompany you. Can we teach each other?" He seemed to be asking Ning Xuemo, but his eyes couldn't help but look at the ancestor. He always felt that the white-clothed god treated Ning Xuemo a little differently. It was as if he had fallen in love with Miss Ning. Men who fell in love were possessive. They probably wouldn't allow other men to play in the water with the woman they liked. Of course, he didn't want to play in the water. He just wanted to take care of her and solve the knot in her heart. The ancestor didn't speak. He was still silent, standing there like a background. Ning Xuemo's eyes lit up. She knew Yi Feng's swimming ability very well. She also knew that he was a very reliable person. Moreover, Xuemo had shared joys and sorrows with him in the water. She had been running for her life in the water for such a long time, yet Yi Feng had taken care of her extremely well. Even in such a dangerous situation, he did not let her drown even a little bit. Swimming with such a person, she wouldn't drown again. She really wanted to get rid of her fear of water, so she didn't care about anything else. When Yi Feng said this, she immediately nodded and blurted out, "Okay." Yi Feng looked at Di Zun again. Di Zun nodded slightly and said, "Don't drown her." She turned around and fluttered away from the coral path, walking into the distance. His voice was very calm, and he didn't hesitate to turn around and leave. It was as if he didn't care about Yi Feng and Ning Xuemo traveling together. Looking at his back, Yi Feng had a complicated look in his eyes. He didn't know about the grievances between Ning Xuemo and the ancestor, but he remembered the last 2 hours when he and Ning Xuemo were on the run. At that time, her eyes lit up and she told him that strong reinforcements were coming. They were about to be saved. As long as he persevered a little longer, he would be out of danger. It was because of this belief that they persevered for more than 4 hours. He clearly remembered that when the white cat in his arms started to say these words, its spirit was excited, its eyes were shining, and its little mouth was even curled up. He could clearly see that the cat in his arms was full of joy. Later, when the reinforcements didn't come for a long time, the white cat in his arms began to feel uneasy. But she still comforted him over and over again, or encouraged herself. She said over and over again that he would come, and that he would be here soon. Perhaps he had already arrived nearby. The Ning Shuamore he knew looked cunning and lively, but she was extremely steady and calm. At that time, it was the first time he saw her like this. He clearly sensed that she was full of hope, then uneasiness, and then despair when she was caught. At that time, Yifeng didn't know who Shuamore's reinforcements were. It wasn't until they were really rescued that he knew it was Di Zun. Chapter 719. However, the ancestor still arrived and saved them. According to reason, Ning Shuamore should be very grateful to this supreme divinity. However, Ning Shuamore's attitude towards the ancestor was a bit strange. Maybe she was Han Shanua's concubine, so she couldn't get close to the ancestor? Or maybe he misunderstood the ancestor? Was the ancestor's concern for Ning Shuamore just an elder's junior? The ancestor's matter wasn't something Yifeng could interfere with, so these thoughts just flashed in his mind before he put them aside. He was also a straightforward person, so he directly jumped into the water. He came to Ning Shuamore's side and said, "Shall we start?" Perhaps subconsciously, Ning Shuamore knew that Yifeng was a strong backing in the water, so she wouldn't drown no matter what, so she was less afraid of water. She tried to go into the water. Not far from the celestial lake, there was a mountain rock with a bamboo forest behind it. The ancestor was sitting in the bamboo forest at this moment. The wind rustled through the trees. The ancestor was sitting on a praying mat with a chess table in front of him. He was playing chess with himself. He looked relaxed and calm, as if he was really immersed in the game. However, people who often watched him play chess could see that he was not playing at his usual level. It was as if he was playing casually. From his position, he could easily hear all the movements in the celestial lake. He heard Shuamore carefully go into the water, heard her movements were stiff when she paddled, and heard Yifeng comforting and encouraging her in a low voice. He heard her voice slowly relax from trembling. He heard her interaction with Yifeng and Karine. He heard that she was no longer nervous when she swam in the water, and she was already following her heart. The sound-transmitting talisman at his waist suddenly lit up. He picked it up, and Rongyue Tianlan's voice came from the talisman. He seemed to have just woken up and was in a good mood. He said, "Di Zue, I suddenly thought of a treatment for hydrophobia. Tell me about it." The ancestor's words were always simple and clear. Di Zue, the reason why she is afraid of water is because she has been severely submerged in water. She lacks a sense of security in water. If there was someone who could give her a strong sense of security by her side to protect her, it would be best if they could play in the water at the same time. Perhaps she could slowly untie the knot in her heart. Di Zue, your swimming skills are not bad. How about? She doesn't believe me. Di Zun only said 4 words before he cut off his jubilant speech. Rongyue Tianlan. Emperor's throne. The ancestor didn't speak again, but he didn't close the sound-transmitting talisman. Rongyue Tianlan could only hear his shallow breathing. A moment later, the ancestor's low voice came from the sound-transmitting charm. "Rongyue, what should I do?" Rongyue Tianlan's hands trembled slightly. The water pressed down on her from all directions, causing her to immediately panic. She could not help but struggle a few times. Fortunately, Yifeng was not far from her and had been paying attention to her. Once he saw that things were not going well, he immediately made a beautiful leap and rushed to Ning Shuamore's side, pulling her out. Because of the timely rescue, Ning Shuamore didn't choke on water this time. However, she was really scared and her face was pale again. Yifeng held her arm and said, "It's okay. Don't be afraid." Ning Shuamore took a deep breath and suppressed her beating heart. She smiled and said, "Yifeng, thank you." When Yifeng saw that she had recovered, he immediately let go of her arm and said, "Are you okay?" Why don't you go ashore and take a rest? Chapter 721. Ning Xuemore shook her head. No need. I'm fine. She had already overcome a large part of her fear. She couldn't let all her previous efforts go to waste. Diving used to be her strong point. She had to overcome her fear before she could practice again. Yifeng didn't say anything else. He only said, "Okay, I want to practice again." As he spoke, he looked at the shore again. When he brought Ning Xuemore out of the water, he vaguely saw a white shadow flash by the shore. However, by the time he finished pacifying Ning Xuemore, the white shadow had disappeared without a trace. He didn't know if his eyes were playing tricks on him. The sun was setting in the west, and the sky was filled with red clouds. In the bamboo forest, Di Zun was still sitting there. The chessboard in front of him was still the same layout. He lowered his eyes slightly. There was a clay stove beside him. The charcoal fire in the stove was blazing, and a pot of water was boiling on the stove. There was a teapot and teacups on the small table next to him. The tea in the teacup was already cold, but he didn't take a sip. He sat there cross-legged with a book on his lap. He also didn't turn a page for a long time. He knew that with Yifeng's help, she had finally overcome her fear of water and even dared to dive again. When she emerged from the water after diving for a few minutes, he even heard her laughter as if she had been relieved of a heavy burden. It was very clear, very proud, and very gratifying. He knew that Xuemore had finally walked out of that psychological shadow. When he heard that she had finally come ashore, he hesitated for a moment when he saw the maid waiting by the shore. The maid was sent by him earlier. She brought a cloth curtain and the clothes that she should change into. He heard Xuemore talking to Yifeng while she was tidying her long hair after changing her clothes. Yifeng also changed into a set of clean clothes. He was carrying a bag on his back. He said goodbye. Ning Xuemore also knew that since Yifeng had returned to his human body, he would definitely return to Yang Ziyuan's side. Ning Xuemore naturally couldn't say anything about this kind of thing. She only hoped that Yifeng could obtain his own happiness. Yifeng did not say anything. He had always been introverted and would never confide in anyone about his plans. Right now, all he cared about was Yiyu's happiness. Only when she was happy could he truly let go. He had planned to say goodbye to Ning Xuemore in the morning and leave, but he didn't expect that Ning Xuemore was so afraid of water, so he stayed for another day without hesitation to accompany her out of her psychological trauma. Now that he saw that she had basically recovered, he was relieved. Naturally, he could leave without worry. He had his own obsession, his own protection. Yifeng's journey was very smooth, perhaps due to the ancestors' arrangements. Chapter 722. What did the ancestor think of her? Or rather, what did he think she was? He didn't say, and she couldn't decide whether to ask or not. Perhaps she should have a good talk with the ancestor. The Sun-Moon sect disciple leading the way was a handsome youth. He was as gentle as water, and had an aura about him that made people want to get close to him like a spring breeze. In Ning Xuemore's heart, Buddha Lotus Mountain was the location of the world's #1 sect, so it must be heavily guarded and filled with traps. However, she didn't expect this place to be so beautiful. Not only was there beautiful scenery everywhere, there weren't any traps or patrolling guards along the way. Occasionally, she would see groups of disciples walking by, chatting and laughing. When they saw the disciple leading the way, they would stop and greet him. They would respectfully call him Martial Uncle Jing, and Ning Xuemore's heart stirred. In the small database she had inquired about earlier, the ancestor did indeed have a direct disciple named Yelu Jing'an, who was in charge of the Sun-Moon sect's affairs. He could be considered a person who was second only to the ancestor. If Yi Qinghuan hadn't been expelled from the sect, she would have to call him senior martial brother. It was rumored that this person was very talented. Not only was he a genius in psychokinesis, he was also very good at planning. After becoming the ancestor's disciple, he cultivated to Earth Grade 7 in less than 10 years, shocking the world. He was highly regarded by the ancestor, and was appointed as an elder of the Sun-Moon sect at a young age. He was in charge of the Sun-Moon sect's affairs. These years, he had managed the Sun-Moon sect well. On this continent, it could be said that he was a person who could make the earth tremble with a stomp of his foot. Ning Xuemore didn't expect that the gentle youth leading the way would be him, and was momentarily surprised. At the same time, her heart stirred. The Sun-Moon sect's rules were actually very strict. A person of Yelu Jing'an status definitely wouldn't be in charge of leading the way. Now that he was personally leading the way for her, someone must have ordered him to do so. And this person could be said to be at her beck and call. Other than the ancestor, who else could order this person, who could be considered a sect leader, to lower himself to lead the way for her? She couldn't help but look at this Yelu Jing'an a few more times. This person looked extremely young, about 20 years old. She also observed the disciples passing by a few times. Handsome men and beautiful women. The men and women he met on Buddha Lotus Mountain were each more pleasing to the eye than the last. The women were of different shapes and sizes, each with their own unique characteristics. The men were all suave, elegant, cold, and cheerful. Ning Xuemore couldn't take it all in. She couldn't help but sigh in her heart. No wonder the people of the pugilistic world all said that the Sun-Moon sect was a place where the best of the best gathered. Looking at it now, it really lived up to its reputation. Even the gardeners who were trimming the flowers and trees among the flowers and trees were handsome and imposing. The ancestor was truly blessed. She could see so many handsome men and beautiful women every day. No wonder he was so aloof and looked down on all the women in the world. With so many handsome men and beautiful women around him, he was probably tired of looking at them, right? Then Ning Xuemore understood that he treated her differently. But why was he acting this way? She slowly recalled all the times she had met him. It was as if all the times she had met him were not pleasant. She lowered her eyes slightly, her thoughts drifting away like catkins. She carefully analyzed everything that had happened between her and the ancestor. From Yi Feng's words, she was even more certain that the ancestor had helped her escape danger from Yi Qingwan. Chapter 723. Ning Xuemore was indeed saved by the ancestor. He saved her and Yi Feng. Then what about Yi Qingwan? She was the ancestor's only female disciple. Did he politely ask Yi Qingwan for her, or did he directly snatch her away? Ning Xuemore had no recollection of this. Ning Xuemore narrowed her eyes. She didn't expect that she had unintentionally given Yi Qingwan a chance to meet the ancestor. She didn't know what kind of shocking scene it would be when the master and disciple met. It was a pity that she was unconscious and didn't see that scene. Ning Xuemore's fingers slowly clenched in her sleeves. The enmity between her and Yi Qingwan was set. That woman had caused her to be so miserable. She had never suffered such a big loss in her life. This debt must be repaid with her own hand. She must also let her taste the feeling of being unable to live and unable to die. But she didn't know if the ancestor would intervene at that time. Would he be biased towards his only female disciple? Ning Xuemore shook her head. She didn't care anymore. She would think about this later. No matter what, she must take revenge. She wouldn't give anyone face. At most, she would find that woman and have a fair duel, regardless of life or death. That way, the ancestor wouldn't say anything else. The most important thing for her now was to become stronger. She must become stronger. As the saying goes, 10 years is not too late for a gentleman to take revenge. She hoped that Yi Qingwan could live a little longer, and not die too early. Master. Another person led a group of disciples over and bowed respectfully to Yelu Jing'an. Ning Xuemore glanced at the group of disciples. Her heart moved. The clothes they were wearing were obviously not from the Sun-Moon sect. Moreover, they had all kinds of uniforms. Most of them were around 13 or 14 years old. There was a hint of childishness between their eyebrows, but each of them was full of spirit and energy. Moreover, there was a hint of curiosity and excitement in their expressions. Could it be that these were new disciples? No. Even if new disciples entered the Sun-Moon sect, they would wear the same uniform. Could it be that they just wanted to recruit him? Ning Xuemore's guess wasn't wrong. The youth leading the group was Yelu Jing'an's disciple. After he finished bowing with the group of half-grown children, he immediately reported, "Shifu, there are a total of 60 people selected this time. After 10 more days of training, we'll be able to see their true aptitude. Then we can ask Shifu to choose." Yelu Jing'an nodded slightly and let his disciple lead that group of people down. Ning Xuemore had vaguely heard that the Sun Moon sect was recruiting new disciples a few days ago. It was not long after she had transmigrated here. At that time, she was busy running for her life, so she did not pay attention to this news at all. He didn't expect to run into it today. Her heart moved and she looked at Yelu Jing'an. Yelu. Facing this youth's face, she really couldn't say the word senior. Thus, he asked vaguely, "May I know the criteria for your sect to accept disciples this time?" Yelu Jing'an smiled faintly. Earth grade level 1 aptitude, single attribute, clever and intelligent can enter. He swept his gaze over those who had just passed by. These were selected from the 800 disciples who applied. The lowest aptitude is Earth grade level 1, but their attributes are not bad, so they were selected. However, these people will go through 3 more rounds of elimination. In the end, only 18 people will remain and formally become disciples. They were indeed geniuses among geniuses, the cream of the crop. No wonder the Sun Moon sect could become more and more powerful. All the cream of the crop came here. Who is accepting disciples this time? Ning Xuemore was curious. Chapter 724. Ning Xuemore had a rough understanding of the people in the Sun Moon sect. Yelu Jing'an answered all her questions. "Us brothers will accept all of them." "Oh right, this time the ancestor will also accept one. And it's not limited to males or females." When he finished speaking, he gave Ning Xuemore a meaningful look. Ning Xuemore's eyes flashed with surprise. Didn't the ancestor only accept one disciple every 80 years? It seemed that his last disciple was Ji Yunhuang's master, and it was only 50 years. Why did he make an exception now? And it's not limited to males or females. If he really accepted a female disciple, then Yi Qinghuan wouldn't be his only female disciple. This would be an extremely heavy blow to that woman. Ning Xuemore's lips curved slightly. The depression in her heart seemed to lessen a little. When she read the master-disciple novel and saw that her master wanted to accept another female disciple, she felt distressed for the female lead. But for Yi Qinghuan, she only felt good. Yelu Jing'an glanced at her and suddenly said, "Miss Ning, do you want to be apprenticed? Maybe you can give it a try." Ning Xuemore was stunned for a moment, but her heart was moved again. Being apprenticed to the ancestor was indeed the fastest way to improve one's skills. But with her status, it would be awkward to be apprenticed to him. He definitely wouldn't accept her. Ning Xuemore shook her head and smiled. "My psychokinesis is now human rank 5. I'm afraid it's not up to your standards, so I don't want it." Yelu Jing'an glanced at her again and smiled. "Miss Ning doesn't need to belittle yourself. The Sun Moon sect doesn't only look at psychokinesis, they also look at other talents. Especially the ancestors' disciples, they don't stick to one pattern. If Miss Ning is interested, you can give it a try. What if you're chosen?" Ning Xuemore pondered for a moment. "I'll think about it." She felt that there was something fishy about this, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Yelu Jing'an smiled warmly and didn't say anything else. She led her back to Heavenly Sound Peak. "Miss Ning must be tired after a day. Go back and rest early." Ning Xuemore paused. She was still traumatized by the water wall enchantment on the Tianyin Peak. Moreover, if she were to stay here to learn, shouldn't she be staying with the new disciples? He even wanted her to go to the Tianyin Peak. "Elder Yelu, I think it would be more appropriate to give me another residence. Heavenly Sound Peak is where the ancestor lives alone. I heard that only his direct disciples can go there. I'm afraid it's not appropriate for me to go there." Yelu Jing'an's footsteps didn't stop. "Lady Ning is overthinking. You are different from others. The ancestor has specially ordered you to stay on the Heavenly Sound Peak for the time being. Until your name is confirmed." While they were speaking, they had already arrived at the foot of the Tianyin Peak. The waterfall was still splashing around like a tidal wave. Yelu Jing'an raised her hand and took out a bamboo umbrella. She handed it to Ning Xuemore. The water enchantment here has been removed. Miss Ning can use the umbrella to enter and exit from here. Ning Xuemore's heart skipped a beat. Was the water enchantment removed for her? Wasn't the ancestor afraid that other people would enter the place where he lived alone? She took the umbrella and jumped towards the waterfall with Yelu Jing'an. The water enchantment really disappeared. The waterfall was just like the legendary waterfall in front of the water curtain cave. After she jumped in, she directly entered a cave. Following the bluestone steps of the cave, she walked up hundreds of steps. Her eyes lit up as she finally saw the familiar scenery. Yelu Jing'an led Ning Xuemore to the side hall where she first woke up. Chapter 725. Yelu Jing'an stopped and said, "Miss Ning, you should rest here. If you need anything, you can directly send me a message." He then handed Ning Xuemore a light green sound transmitting talisman and taught her how to use it. The method was a bit complicated, but Ning Xuemore was very smart. She learned such a complicated method after seeing it once and quickly became proficient in it. Yelu Jing'an looked at her with surprise, as if he didn't expect her to learn so quickly. Looking at her, his eyes flashed with a touch of deep thought, but he didn't say anything. He was about to say goodbye when Ning Xuemore suddenly said, "Do the ancestors' disciples all live in this hall for a while?" The hall she was referring to was the one they were going to live in now, and it was also the only side hall on this peak. Yi Qingwan had also cloned a smaller one. Yi Qingwan was so fond of this side hall that she didn't hesitate to clone one for her. Presumably, she had lived in this hall and left a good impression, so even if she was expelled from the sect, she was still reluctant to leave this place. Yelu Jing'an shook his head. "No, even if we become the ancestors' disciples, we will still live at the bottom of the peak. When the ancestor teaches martial arts, we will come up." He glanced at the side hall. "Miss is the first to live in this place." Yelu Jing'an turned around and left, leaving such a bomb for Ning Xuemore to digest for a moment. She shook her head, not willing to think too deeply, and walked into the side hall. She was really tired and needed a good sleep. As for the ancestor, Xuemore hadn't seen him since she came up, so she didn't know if he was in the main hall. Since she was living in his territory, it was reasonable to go and greet him. Ning Xuemore was a person of action, so she immediately went to the main hall to look for him. There weren't many buildings on Heavenly Sound Peak. After an hour, Ning Xuemore had already searched the entire Heavenly Sound Peak, but she didn't see the ancestor's figure. Since she couldn't find him, Ning Xuemore gave up on searching and returned to the side hall to rest. Ning Xuemore had a habit of checking the place she slept in before she could feel at ease. It was like an obsessive-compulsive disorder that could not be changed. Therefore, she was no exception here. She secretly checked the inside and outside of the hall, and only felt relieved after confirming that there was nothing out of the ordinary. She actually found a book on a wooden shelf in the hall. The book was thread-bound, and on the cover of the book were a few large, flamboyant words, "Jade Firmament Wisdom Technique." The handwriting went straight through the back of the paper. It was extremely beautiful. Every word seemed to be able to fly out of the paper. Although Ning Xuemore had never seen this handwriting before, she felt it vaguely familiar. No one else had lived in this place before, so it shouldn't have been left behind by the previous occupant. Then, did this book belong to the ancestor? A person like him shouldn't have the habit of casually throwing books, right? So this book was obviously placed here for her to read. Ning Xuemore didn't stand on ceremony. She flipped through a few pages, and her heart pounded wildly. What was written on the book was the cultivation method of the wood and fire dual element technique. Moreover, the explanation was simple and easy to understand. After reading a few pages, Ning Xuemore felt as if she was suddenly enlightened. After she came to this world, because of her identity, she had been on the run and didn't join any sect. Therefore, the cultivation books she got were all unofficial versions. Not only was the writing obscure and difficult to understand, but there were also many contradictions. Chapter 726. To put it simply, the cultivation books that Ning Shuamore got were like those sold on the streets, those martial arts manuals that cost a few yuan each. They looked mysterious but didn't have much practical value. But now, this book was extremely orthodox and very suitable for Ning Shuamore's physique to cultivate. It was as if it was specially written for her. It made her feel like she had found a treasure. She wanted to become strong so much. She had been struggling to find a way, but this book had opened a golden door for her on the path of cultivation. It made her see hope. What made her even more surprised was that although this book looked thin, it was like opening a treasure bowl after opening it. It was inexhaustible, and there was no end to flipping through it. Ning Shuamore didn't delay and immediately started cultivating according to what was written in the book. 5 days, she tempered without sleep or food for 5 days. In these 5 days, she was 100 times more diligent than the sprinting before the college entrance exam. Every day, she was cultivating, and cultivating. When she was really tired to the extreme, she fell asleep on the bed and rested for 2 to 4 hours before climbing up to continue cultivating. Out of the 24 hours in a day, she would spend 20 hours in cultivation. Even when she occasionally dreamed, she would dream about the contents of that book. In these 5 days, Di Zun didn't come to see her, but that Yelu Jing'an came many times. In the beginning, every time he came, it was to deliver food to Ning Shuamore. Every meal was different, and the color, smell, and taste were all excellent, but Ning Shuamore was now wholeheartedly focused on cultivating. Even when the food was placed on her table, she often forgot to eat. When Yelu Jing'an started delivering food to her, he was afraid to disturb her, so he only put the food on the table, thinking that she would naturally eat after she finished cultivating. Later, he found that it didn't work. The food he delivered was left cold on the table, untouched. Yelu Jing'an had long seen through her cultivation. It hadn't reached the level where she couldn't eat. She always forgot that eating was bad for her body. So for the next few days, after he sent her in, he would stand in the same spot and wait for her to finish her cultivation before immediately calling her to eat. He would only leave when he saw her walk to the table and start eating. What he didn't expect was that although Ning Shuamore ate, she would often eat 3 to 5 mouthfuls before she hurriedly went back to practicing martial arts. She still didn't touch much of the food. She was too eager to become stronger. This kind of training was simply like going crazy. It was as if he didn't want his life anymore. Her skills had indeed improved a lot, but she had also lost a lot of weight. Chapter 727. Yelu Jing'an was also a qualified master. His explanations were simple and easy to understand, which often made Ning Shuamore feel enlightened. His work was dependable, his temperament was gentle, and he was neither impatient nor impatient. Moreover, he was very meticulous. Sometimes, when Ning Shuamore encountered a difficult problem, before she could even open her mouth to ask, he would already explain it to her according to her symptoms. This allowed her to avoid taking unnecessary detours. This Yelu Jing'an was simply a hard-to-come-by good master. What was even harder to come by was that he cultivated the same type of technique as her. Ning Shuamore benefited a lot, but once she couldn't help but ask, "Elder Yelu, what are the conditions for accepting a disciple? Do you accept a female disciple?" Yelu Jing'an paused for a moment, smiled, and changed the topic. If he were to accept a disciple, naturally it would be someone like Ning Shuamore. Although her innate talent wasn't the highest, she was smart, hardworking, and could understand everything with just a hint. Others could draw inferences, but she could draw inferences. Every time he exchanged techniques with Shuamore, he would be shocked by her sharp mind. This kind of disciple was something everyone would fight over, but even if he liked her, he didn't dare to accept her, otherwise his master would slap him to death. Sometimes Yelu Jing'an felt that Ning Shuamore was too tired, so he suggested that she go out for a stroll. In order to attract her, he even talked about some wonderful scenery on Buddha Lotus Mountain. But Ning Shuamore's desire to become strong was too strong, so she didn't want to waste a second. Other than occasionally chatting with Yelu Jing'an during meals, she didn't have the slightest intention of going out. It was a feeling that even 9 oxen couldn't pull her out. This made Yelu Jing'an frown. He was really afraid that if this continued, Ning Xuemore would directly collapse from exhaustion. Her desire to quickly become strong had already become a kind of obsession. In these 5 days, the ancestor didn't appear once. Although this was his territory, there was no trace of him. Ning Xuemore would occasionally be puzzled, but she also knew that the ancestor always appeared and disappeared like a ghost. Even his most trusted disciple might not know his whereabouts, so Ning Xuemore didn't care about his sudden disappearance. Adding on to the fact that she was fully focused on cultivating, she even forgot to greet him. In the 1,000-year ice cave, on the 1,000-year chilled jade bed, the ancestor sat quietly with his eyes closed. He wore a set of extremely simple white robes. His hands were placed on his knees, and a faint white light was slowly revolving around them. The white jade mask on his face had also been removed, revealing his celestial features. He sat there motionless, like an ice sculpture. He didn't know how long he had been like this. His body trembled slightly, and his face paled as he opened his eyes. He couldn't calm his heart. He actually couldn't calm his heart. For thousands of years, his heart was as calm as still water. Every time he entered a meditative state, he would instantly enter the highest realm of cultivation, forgetting himself and others. When he went into seclusion, he could stay in seclusion for half a year, and he would not move or wake up for half a year. But not this time. Ever since Ning Xuemore ran away from the marriage and he began to search for her, he had encountered all kinds of unexpected situations. In order to find her, he had no choice but to use a few forbidden techniques and expend a lot of his psyche. In order to remove the disguise technique for her, he once again resisted his exhaustion and used the technique for her. In the process, because he overestimated his ability to control her, he injured himself when he withdrew his palm. After removing the disguise technique for Xuemore, he was also exhausted to the extreme. He almost didn't even have the strength to carry her back to her room. In order to heal her pair of legs, he flipped through medical books for an entire night. Early the next morning, he went to the demon realm to get some strange herbs. Chapter 728. Although the process was difficult, fortunately, it was more daunting than dangerous. On the surface, the ancestor seemed to have left in a fit of anger, as if he no longer cared about her, but in his heart, she was constantly on his mind, fearing that she would cause more trouble. He didn't have time to rest and rushed back. When he came back, he found that her soul was missing. In order to find her soul, he used a lot of psychokinesis. It was not easy for him to find her. Once again, he used his overused psychokinesis to straighten out her soul. After this series of incidents, he was almost at the end of his rope. According to Rongyue Tianlan, he had to cultivate in seclusion for 15 days to recover. But he was always worried about Ning Xuemore. He always felt guilty and wanted to see her. It was the first time he felt this kind of longing for a person, caring about a person, worrying about personal gains and losses. It was the first time he experienced it. His heart always seemed to be undulating. This situation made it difficult for the ancestor to cultivate in seclusion. He also didn't want to cultivate in seclusion because of his own ability. It wasn't until Xuemore played with Yi Fengshui in the celestial lake that she slowly overcame her fear of water, that he waited for her in the bamboo forest for an entire day, that he finally couldn't hold on any longer. When he spat out a mouthful of blood, he knew that he had to go into seclusion. If he didn't cultivate in seclusion, it would be a permanent injury. It would be very difficult to recover. He could only choose to cultivate in seclusion. But after all, he was worried about Ning Xuemore, so he sent his most capable disciple, Yelu Jing'an, to stay by her side. Yelu Jing'an was a very careful person. He was very reliable. He always did things according to the ancestors' orders. It was reasonable to say that he should be relieved after making such a careful arrangement. But for some reason, he still couldn't calm down. He meditated for at least 2 days and 2 nights without talking or moving. But this time, he couldn't sit for a day before he opened his eyes uneasily. The first thing he did when he opened his eyes was to contact Yelu Jing'an and ask about Ning Xuemore's situation. Although he didn't see Ning Shuamore in these 5 days, he knew her situation like the back of his hand. The more he understood, the harder it was for him to calm down. It was true that the girl wanted to become stronger, but he didn't expect her to work so hard. This mental cultivation method of his was particular about progressing step by step, steadily and surely, avoiding impatience. If she continued to work hard like this, he was afraid that she would cultivate an inner demon. He had told Yelu Jing'an to explain the situation to Ning Shuamore, but it didn't seem to have much effect. Because he was thinking about this, he became even more restless while cultivating. This time, he didn't even spend half a day in seclusion before he woke up again. Yelu Jing'an didn't know that the ancestor was actually in seclusion and thought that he was traveling outside, so every time she reported to him, she was very detailed and clear. This was exactly what he wanted. After waking up this time, the first thing he did was contact Yelu Jing'an. This time, Yelu Jing'an was a bit hesitant when she received it. Her first sentence was, "Master, she's showing signs of qi deviation. Disciple has just helped her recuperate. There are no other accidents. She's still practicing now." The ancestor's fingers tightened. "Let her rest." Yelu Jing'an's voice was a bit awkward. "Master, she looks like she listens to Disciple's words, but after Disciple leaves, she'll practice as soon as she wakes up. It wasn't suitable for a man like him to guard here at night." The ancestor frowned. This was a sign that she had entered an inner demon. He simply ordered, "Hit her sleeping acupoint." Although this method was simple and crude, it was effective on her. Chapter 729. A moment later, Yelu Jing'an's voice came from the sound-transmitting talisman. "Master, she is already sleeping. She can sleep for about 10 hours and will wake up tomorrow morning." Yelu Jing'an actually had a headache. This time it was solved, but what should he do in the future? After she wakes up, he was afraid that she would still cultivate day and night. How could he hit her sleep acupuncture point again and again? He looked at Ning Shuamore's sleeping face and was somewhat lost in thought. What exactly did this girl go through to have such a strong obsession with martial arts? He had never seen a girl who cultivated so crazily. When the obsession was too strong, it would become a heart demon, and this heart demon must be treated with care and medicine. He turned around and walked out, sitting in front of the stone table outside the hall for the entire night. Although he didn't know the relationship between the ancestor and this girl, he knew that she was someone the ancestor cared about greatly. He definitely couldn't let anything happen to her in his hands. Perhaps he could only spend the night with her. Ning Shuamore didn't sleep well that night. She had countless strange and messy dreams. In her dreams, there were horses and spears, blood flowed like a river, and many people and things appeared. But when she woke up, she couldn't remember the scenes in her dreams. She slept for 8 hours. According to the modern calculation, it was 8 hours. After being forced to rest for a while, her spirit recovered a lot. Just as she was about to cultivate again, she suddenly heard a melodious flute sound. The flute sound was very peaceful, like a flower slowly blooming in the spring breeze. It had the power to calm people's hearts, calming Ning Shuamore's restless heart from cultivating. To Ning Shuamore, this flute sound was like a lullaby she heard in her dreams. It was familiar and intimate. She didn't know why, but when she heard this flute sound like spring flowers and autumn moons, her eyes inexplicably turned sour. She had the urge to cry. She took a deep breath and naturally understood who was playing this flute sound. The ancestor. He had disappeared for 5 days and now he had finally returned. Then she should go see him. After all, he had saved her life, bestowed her the book, and took her in. She jumped off the bed and was about to run out the door. Occasionally, she lowered her head and saw her wrinkled clothes. She was startled. How did he become so sloppy? These few days, she was a bit obsessed with cultivating. Her meals were all eaten under Yelu Jing'an's coercion. As for washing up, she seemed to have only washed up 2 days ago. What have I become? Fortunately, there was a dressing mirror in the room. She looked at herself in the mirror and her body swayed. Was the crazy woman in the mirror her? Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair was messy, her face was pale, and there was a suspicious drool stain on her cheeks. Chapter 730. Ning Xuemore fetched some water for herself and prepared to take a bath and clean herself up. Although she was always quick with her work, she was too sloppy this time. She had to wash twice to completely clean the dirt on her body. By the time she was done, it was already half an hour later. The sound of the flute was long and didn't stop. Ning Xuemore looked into the mirror and found that she looked pretty good. Although her eyes were still a little red, it was good that she looked presentable. She then ran out. She listened in the courtyard and found that the sound of the flute was still coming from the vicinity of the White Tower. It seemed that the ancestor liked to play the flute there to attract phoenixes. She hoped that she wouldn't disturb his mood if she ran over. Ning Xuemore's guess was correct. The ancestor was indeed near the White Tower. He sat lazily on top of it, his black hair scattered around his body like a curtain. He wore a white robe with dark silver patterns, and the white jade mask on his face shone slightly under the sunlight. White tower, white robe, green jade flute, against the sea of clouds behind him, this scene was as beautiful as the ink mountains and rivers written by an immortal. It was almost impossible to move one's eyes away from it. He lowered his eyes and played the flute. This time, he attracted even more beasts and birds. Not only were there on the bamboo shoots and on the mountain peaks, but even in the sky above his head, there were a few colorful birds with long tails, spreading their wings and dancing to the flute. Ning Xuemore stood at the edge of the cliff and looked at him without saying anything. First, she couldn't disturb him. Second, his flute was indeed as warm as the spring breeze. It could calm all restless emotions. The cold wind was howling here, but listening to his flute made her feel like bathing in the spring breeze. She almost wanted to sit down and meditate. The flute finally stopped. The ancestor looked at her without any emotion in his eyes. The first thing he said was, "How's your cultivation?" Ning Xuemore also remembered her mission. She cupped her hands and saluted him, many thanks to the ancestor for the book. Xuemore benefited a lot. When she first came, she was at the 5th level of the human realm. In just 5 days, she had broken through 2 levels and was now at the 7th level of the human realm. This kind of leveling speed was almost legendary, but it was still not enough. Among the newly qualified disciples, the lowest was Earth Stage Level 1. She would need to break through 3 levels in order to catch up to the lowest level. This kind of gap was simply despairing. Fortunately, Ning Xuemore had the spirit of never giving up. In her dictionary, there was no such thing as being inferior to others. If she went back, she would continue to cultivate. She might be able to reach Earth Stage Level 1 in 5 days. Haste makes waste. The ancestor's gaze fell on her. "Haven't you heard of this sentence?" Ning Xuemore paused. Of course, she had heard of this saying before, but her sense of urgency was so strong that she almost couldn't control herself. "Thank you, Di Zun, for your advice. Xuemore will remember and pay attention to it." Ning Xuemore also knew that Di Zun was doing this for her own good, so she sincerely thanked him. Di Zun tightened his grip on the jade flute. Did she not know how to say anything other than thanking him? "Come here." Di Zun looked at her and said again. Ning Xuemore raised her head and looked at the White Tower. It was about 7 floors high and occupied the entire opposite mountain peak. It was surrounded by empty air and was connected by only a small finger-thick iron chain. The mountain wind here was not small, blowing the thin chain like a swing. Under the White Tower, the sea of clouds was steaming. It was impossible to see what was under the sea of clouds, but it was most likely a cliff. Chapter 731. If Ning Xuemore wanted to jump to the top of the tower, she would have to run to the center of the thin chain and then use the force to fly up. The White Tower was straight up and down, looking like it was directly frozen out of white ice. At first glance, it was obvious that it would be slippery. Once she stepped on air, she would directly fall down. Since she came to this world, she didn't know how many times she had jumped off cliffs. There was already a shadow in her heart, and when she saw a cliff, she would instinctively resist. Moreover, the top of the tower was so small that it felt like it was on the verge of collapse. If she went up, she might not even be able to find a place to stand. Di Zun, if you have something to say, just say it. Shuemor won't go over. Ning Shuemor declined. Don't you want to become stronger? The Di Zun bowed his head and asked. Of course. Ning Shuemor answered without hesitation this time. She wanted to become stronger too much. Then come over. Okay. Ning Shuemor raised her eyes to look at the Di Zun on the top of the tower. His white robe fluttered as he stood there, like a god who was aloof from the world. This kind of person shouldn't be willing to see her in real danger, right? Then she would give it a try. She took a light breath, and with a leap, she landed on the thin chain. The tip of her foot touched the chain, wanting to take advantage of the momentum to jump up. Unexpectedly, just as the tip of her foot touched the chain, it suddenly sank down. Ning Shuemor didn't feel like she was stepping on the chain. Instead, she felt like she was stepping into a swamp. It was as if two small hands had reached out from the swamp and were desperately clasping her feet. Not only did she not jump up, her body suddenly swayed, and in a split second, the sky and earth spun around her, and she fell straight down. Fuck, this thin chain wasn't the way to the other side, it was a trap. Ning Shuemor was shocked. She hurriedly exerted strength on her feet, flipped her body upside down, and grabbed the thin chain with both hands. Her fingers clearly touched the thin iron chain, but she didn't expect that the iron chain would turn into an illusion in an instant. She grabbed it as if she was grabbing a handful of fine powder. She watched as the thin iron chain shattered like dust, and she grabbed nothing. What's false is real, what's true is false. What's true in the heart is true, what's false in the heart is false. Qi flows to the Dantian. The venerable sovereign at the top of the tower quickly spat out a string of words. Ning Shuemor was originally falling, but when she heard his words, she faintly felt a sense of familiarity. She didn't have time to think and immediately adjusted her breathing in the air. Her eyes flashed, and she finally saw that there was another transparent thin chain that was about the thickness of a strand of hair beside the thin chain. She chanted the wood incantation in her heart. Suddenly, a thin green vine flew out from her palm and wrapped around the transparent chain. This was real. Ning Shuemor immediately sensed it. She flipped her wrist and used the force of the pull to flip up and land on top of the white tower. Everything else was fake, but the white tower couldn't be fake, right? As long as she used the force twice in the middle, she would be able to fly to the top of the tower. The tip of her foot landed on the wall of the white tower, and then sank inwards. Her foot seemed to have kicked into the void. Bastard, this white tower was also fake. She helplessly watched the towering white tower shatter under her feet and scatter in all directions like meteors. Even the venerable sovereign at the top of the tower directly disappeared. Why was it all fake? Wasn't it a little bit real? Ning Shuemor almost wanted to curse during the process of falling. The wind whistled in her ears. Her body passed through the clouds below, and then, plop, she fell into a warm embrace. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned her head and saw an enlarged white jade mask in front of her. Chapter 732. The pair of eyes behind the white jade mask were as dark as the abyss. At this moment, they were slightly curved into a beautiful arc. Shuemor fell into his arms under his wide robe. His arm was around her waist, and he spun in the air and rushed straight up. Ning Shuemor's eyes blurred, and she had already landed on the glazed roof of the white jade tower. The top of the tower was narrow, less than 2 feet wide. She and the Di Zun stood side by side on the top, so their bodies were inevitably pressed against each other. The Di Zun's arm was around her waist, and his flowing hair gently fluttered over her neck, making her feel itchy. His white jade mask was different from the one Shuemor saw last time. Last time, only his black eyes were exposed, and the rest of his face was covered. But this time, not only could she see his eyes, but she could also see his perfectly curved lips. His lips were almost close to Shuemor's ear, and his warm breath made her whole ear burn. Her body stiffened for a moment. His approach made her subconsciously feel dangerous, and she couldn't help but whisper, "Let go of me." Her voice was a bit stiff. The Di-Zun's eyes slightly deepened, and he readily agreed, "Okay." His arm loosened, and he really let go of her. As soon as he let go, Ning Xuemore suddenly felt her feet slip. The glazed roof that she had stepped on turned into an illusion in the blink of an eye. She stepped on empty air, and her heart was shocked, and she subconsciously hugged him. So, she hugged the Di-Zun's waist again. The Di-Zun looked down at her. "This time, I didn't let go of you." Strangely, the moment her arms hugged his waist, the glazed roof under her feet turned solid again. Ning Xuemore was speechless. Her pretty face was faintly red, and she regretted listening to him. If she didn't have the idea of jumping up, she wouldn't be in such a dilemma. She turned her head to look at the path she came from, and began to think about jumping back. But after looking at the path, Xuemore subconsciously tightened her arms around his waist. Clouds and mist rose from all sides like waves, surging in wave after wave. The white tower she and the ancestor were in was like a lone tower standing in the middle of a sea of clouds, with no land in sight. She couldn't find the mountain peak she had come from, let alone know where was the safest place to jump. "Are you scared?" The ancestor's voice seemed to contain a smile. There was a hint of teasing in his voice. Ning Xuemore secretly gritted her teeth. "I'm not afraid," she replied stiffly. "If you're not afraid, then why are you hugging me so tightly? You seem to be hurting my waist." The ancestor looked down at her. The little girl was curled up on him like a koala. Two warm and soft arms hugged his waist, hugging him so tightly. The ancestor felt that this feeling was very good, and he gently twirled the jade flute in his hand. Although Rong Yutianlan wasn't very reliable at times, his method of picking up girls was quite reliable. The first way to pick up a girl: find a similar hobby. If the zither and the zither are compatible, you will definitely be able to hook the beauty's heart. This method didn't seem to work. He used the flute to summon Xuemore, but she was still so guarded against him. The second method of picking up girls was to take risks together. It would be best if they fell off a cliff together, so he could hug her justifiably. Generally, a beauty's heart would soften after a few hugs. The ancestor felt that this method was a bit difficult to do. With his kung fu, falling off a cliff wouldn't hurt him at all. Moreover, if they really fell off the cliff, the little girl had many ways to save herself, and he didn't need to save her at all. Chapter 733. Even if Xuemore needed his help when she fell off the cliff, it would only take him a moment to save her. He had never heard of anyone who couldn't reach the bottom after falling off a cliff for a few minutes. The time was too short. Even if he hugged a beauty, he wouldn't feel anything. He couldn't fall off an ordinary cliff, but he couldn't risk falling off the cliff below the White Tower. The ancestor pondered for an hour before dawn and finally thought of the White Tower that only he could climb. He had successfully fooled the little girl and now she was hugging him enthusiastically. The ancestor felt that he had made a profit this time. It was the first time he had been hugged like this. He looked at the little girl in his arms and felt a little strange. It turned out that this was the feeling of being hugged by the person you liked. His heart was warm, and he subconsciously wanted to hug her back. However, Ning Xuemore was clenching her teeth in her heart. What does this great deity mean? Was it really appropriate for him to tease her with his identity as the ancestor? Wasn't he afraid of exposing his identity in front of her? Xuemore hugged his thin waist. Her nose was filled with his light fragrance, which made her feel a little dizzy and her heart beat faster. At the same time, there was an inexplicable repulsion. Xuemore wanted to let go, but her survival instinct made her not dare to. If a drowning person caught a piece of driftwood, even if they knew it was a trap, they wouldn't let go easily. His teasing words made Xuemore blush. She loosened her arms slightly and tried to calm herself down. "Ancestor, please send me back to where I came from. I don't think this tower is a place I should come up. If you want to go back to where you came from, you need to work hard yourself." The ancestor said, his voice still flat. Work hard herself. How could she work hard? Now, there was a vast expanse of clouds and mist, but the scenery was almost the same. Even the 8 sides of the White Tower were exactly the same. She couldn't tell which direction she was going, asking the ancestor to point me in the right direction. Ning Xuemore tried her best to use words to distance the two of them. Her tone was incomparably polite. The ancestor looked down at her. She kept her head down, so he couldn't see the expression on Xuemore's face. However, her unfamiliarity with him made him feel uncomfortable. He said faintly, "Usually, when I'm guiding someone, that person is kneeling." Ning Xuemore was speechless. Actually, it was not that she did not want to kneel down, but she could not let go of him now. Once she knelt down, she would be hugging his legs, hugging his waist. She still felt a little pressured. If she hugged his leg, she felt that she was still a little shy. Just as she was in a dilemma, her waist suddenly tightened. The ancestor had finally hugged her. In the blink of an eye, the ancestor had already sat down with her in his arms. "I've been a little tired recently, so I'll take a rest." Ning Xuemore was carried in his arms in a princess carry position, half sitting on his lap. The ancestor's arm was wrapped around her waist, allowing her to lean on his chest. This posture was really not an ordinary intimate one. Moreover, once he sat down, there was no place for her to stand. Ning Xuemore raised her face to look at his white jade mask. Her body was a little stiff. She didn't understand the meaning behind his series of actions. Or perhaps she understood it in her heart, but subconsciously avoided it. Moreover, once he sat down, even if she wanted to go all out and kneel down, she couldn't find a place to do so. "Ancestor?" Ning Xuemore didn't know what he was selling in his gourd. She could only sit stiffly in his arms and cope with the changes by sticking to the status quo. Chapter 734. The ancestor closed his eyes slightly and said lightly, "I'm going to rest for a while. Don't disturb me." Ning Xuemore was speechless. Is he going to meditate here? But he could just sit there and meditate. Why did he have to make her sit in his arms? In this case, Ning Xuemore couldn't jump out of his arms with a chaste face. She simply sat on his body and looked around. When she came up, the White Tower was not far from the road she came from. She remembered that it was only a few dozen feet away, so she should be able to see it at a glance. The reason why she couldn't see it now was probably because it was covered by some array or some kind of spell. What method should she use to make the mountain appear again? She looked around again and again, trying to find a flaw in it. But it was strange. When she looked at the White Tower from the opposite mountain, she only saw white clouds around the White Tower. The sea of clouds undulated like thin waves, which was the same as the sea of clouds she saw on other mountains. But at this moment, sitting on the top of the White Tower with the ancestor, she found that the white clouds were constantly changing, and their shapes were all kinds of strange. Sometimes, it was like a battlefield where two armies were facing each other. All kinds of people appeared on the battlefield, fighting back and forth, and all kinds of arrays emerged endlessly. Sometimes, it was like a martial arts competition between several masters. The people formed by the white clouds made all kinds of movements, and each scene was like a slow-motion movie. Every move and every style could be seen clearly. Moreover, every single one of those moves was something Ning Xuemore had never seen or heard of before. At first, she was a little absent-minded, but after watching a few scenes in succession, she slowly sat up and looked at the movements of those white clouds. She couldn't help but start to remember those martial arts. The more she watched, the more addicted she became. In the end, she was so engrossed that she forgot where she was and that she was sitting in the ancestor's arms. Addicted to watching, she couldn't help but stretch out her hand subconsciously. The ancestor opened his eyes and looked at her, who was completely fascinated in his arms. She had lost a lot of weight, and there were many red streaks in her eyes. This showed how hard she had been working recently. His palm seemed to have accidentally pressed on her back. Soon, he measured her current level of psychokinesis according to the flow of psychokinesis in her body. She was at the 7.5 level of the human realm. In the past, he wouldn't even bother to look at this level of telekinesis. But it was a miracle for this little girl. To be able to cultivate to such a level in just a few short months, It was truly a legend that no ordinary person would have ever imagined. Perhaps she was the weakest in the Sun-Moon sect, but in other sects, she was a fine jade that others couldn't even dream of snatching. He had seen how difficult her journey had been. Now that Shuamore could be like this, he was very gratified. She was not ordinary. She had too many miracles that made people's eyes light up. Like a shining magnet, it attracted the attention of countless people. Of course, it also attracted his attention. She had created so many miracles, so it should be related to her soul. In fact, Di Zun had noticed from the very beginning that she and her body were not the same person. It was as if she had reincarnated in another body. He had a slight suspicion that her original body was from the devil world, but after seeing Shuamore's illusion in the stone spirit's stomach, he knew that she was indeed a human, a real human. However, the soul came from a different world that even he didn't know about. Chapter 735. Shuamore's mind was full of wonderful ideas, and some of her actions were shocking. At first, he didn't like it, but after looking at her for a long time, he felt that this was who she was, and it was this kind of her that attracted his attention. The ancestor felt that his vision was very good, and the people he liked were naturally the best. This kind of unpolished jade was dug out by him, and in time, as long as the rough stone skin was worn away, she would shine like a beautiful jade. He secretly checked Shuamore's internal breath. There was indeed a slight deviation, but it was far from the point of qi deviation. Yelu Jing'an didn't dare to have any physical contact with her, so he panicked when he saw her vomit blood. According to the ancestor's deduction, her qi should have gone a little astray, which stimulated some of the accumulated poison in her body, causing her to vomit blood. In fact, vomiting blood should be a good thing, as the remaining poison came out. Moreover, she seemed to have recuperated herself, so he felt that there wasn't anything wrong with her body. It seemed that although this little girl practiced with all her might, she didn't disregard her life. The ancestor was very relieved. He pressed his palm on her back, and quietly sent in a bit of psychokinesis to recuperate her qi and blood. Only when she was completely fine did he let go. At this time, Ning Shuamore was completely attracted by the white cloud person, so she entered a state of oblivion. She didn't pay attention to what the ancestor was doing to her body. He looked at Shuamore in his arms. She had lost a lot of weight, and her chin was sharp. Perhaps it was because she was wearing a wine-red dress, but her face didn't look pale. Because she was practicing, her cheeks were faintly red, like rouge on white jade. Her black hair covered her forehead, and in the middle of her hair was a bright red coral hairpin. The rest of her hair fell over her shoulders, making her eyes look even bigger and her mouth small. Her eyelashes were so long that they could almost hold a brush. At this moment, she was focused, and her beautiful face was full of expressions. Her eyes were shining like clear water. He suddenly had an impulse to kiss her. Sitting in the arms of a beautiful woman was a test of a man's willpower. What's more, she was moving in his arms from time to time, rubbing here and there, making his breath a little unstable. He had been working hard for her these past few days. Even with his physique, he was almost at the end of his rope. He couldn't continue meditating in the ice cave because he heard that she almost went berserk. Therefore, the ancestor simply came out of seclusion early this morning. He checked on her, who was sleeping soundly in the side chamber, and only left when he felt that she was fine. He came here to let Ning Shuamore throw herself into his arms. Secondly, he really wanted to recover here. The heaven and earth spirit qi here was much more abundant than in other places. It was much better for him to cultivate here than in other places. His plan was to meditate with Shuamore in his arms. With her wisdom, she should be able to see some of the formations formed by the white clouds. Naturally, she would be able to cultivate. Everything was developing according to his expectations. The only thing he didn't expect was himself. With the beauty in his arms, he was no longer worried about Shuamore, but he still couldn't calm down and meditate. Some of her unconscious movements were fatal to him, and he couldn't help but have a reaction. Originally, when he saw her, he wanted to protect her under his wings and watch her grow up healthily. When he saw that she didn't walk the right path, he would feel angry. That feeling was like looking at a bright pearl that was covered with a layer of dirt. Chapter 736. The Di wanted to wipe away the stains with lightning-fast methods, wiping away all the bad things about her. Therefore, he used methods to punish her. Although in the process of punishment, he had a strange feeling of heartache, but he didn't regret it. Because he knew that it was for her own good. He didn't want a bright pearl to be buried like this. This feeling was more similar to cherishing talent, but it was not the same as the feeling he had for his own disciple. But he couldn't tell what was different about it. Now, he didn't know when his feelings for Shuemore had changed. Originally, he just wanted to keep her by his side, but now he wanted to hold her in his arms and press her under his body. This was the first time he had felt this way. It made him feel novel and a little at a loss. For the first time in his life, he had the idea of wanting a person. Looking at her gesticulating in his arms, he was reminded of her stunning peeper dance. At that time, he seemed to have the idea of holding Shuemore in his arms, wanting her to only bloom in front of him. Such a hot dance. Her body was soft like a willow, and her waist was like a snake. She was like a demon tempting people to eat the forbidden fruit. His lower abdomen tightened again. It was as if hot blood was gathering at a certain point. Ning Shuemore was dancing when she suddenly felt a little uncomfortable under her body. She was still immersed in those movements. After feeling a little uncomfortable, she couldn't help but grab the thing under her body, trying to push it away. This grab was very accurate. Thereupon, the Di. His body instantly tensed up. Ning Shuemore felt that something was wrong. She couldn't push it away, and it seemed to be harder. She even felt the scorching temperature on it. She frowned, but still didn't react. She pulled the thing to the side again. She heard a low gasp, "Let go." The voice was cold with a hint of hoarseness. The hot and magnetic voice rippled in her ears. Ning Shuemore's ears were hot, and she finally woke up. By the time she realized what she was holding, blood rushed to her cheeks. Her face was so hot that it was almost burning. She hurriedly let go and jumped up. In her nervousness, she forgot that she was at the top of the White Tower. The moment she jumped up, she immediately flipped over and fell down. Di was speechless. His soul was almost blown away by that grab. By the time he reacted, the beauty on his lap had already fallen into the sea of cloud. His expression changed. He cursed under his breath and jumped down as well. He fell down again. She fell down again. Ning Shuemore only had this thought in her mind as the wind whistled past her ears. Fortunately, she finally gained some experience from falling. She immediately adjusted her body in the air and prepared to grab anything she could grab along the way. However, there was none. Around her were white clouds that were scattered by her rapidly falling body. Other than these, she couldn't even catch a single strand of grass. Speed meditation mantra. A voice suddenly sounded in his ear. It was the ancestors. He quickly said the name of a mental cultivation method. Ning Shuemore's heart skipped a beat. She immediately recalled the mental cultivation method that allowed her to walk in the air. However, how did the ancestor know? She remembered that she had learned this mental cultivation method after the adventure in the Tianshu Mountains. She rarely had the chance to use it, and she had never used it in front of the ancestor. This was naturally not the time to think about these questions. Ning Shuemore immediately activated the mental cultivation method. Chapter 737. Because she hadn't practiced this technique for a long time, she was a little unfamiliar with it. When she used it for the first time, she even stumbled a little. Moreover, the speed of falling was too fast. In a flash, she had fallen a few hundred meters. This cliff wasn't very deep. It was only a little more than 1,000 meters. It was like parachuting. There had to be enough height to open the parachute. And the place Ning Shuemore fell from was too low. Before she could fully adjust her mental cultivation method, she could already see a large patch of withered yellow flying towards her. The trees were brandishing their fangs and brandishing their claws. They were like tyrannical crabs pointing at the sky. Ning Xuemo's body was falling towards those branches. Although her martial arts were very high now, falling in this state without any support, the force of gravity and acceleration was still very shocking. If she fell like this, she would most likely break some branches, but she would also most likely be skewered like a tanghulu. Even if she didn't become a tanghulu, it was very likely that she would fall and break her legs and arms. Idiot! A whisper sounded in her ear. A white figure flashed in front of her eyes. Her waist was immediately tightened. She was held in someone's arms. The person spun in the air like a whirlwind, reducing most of the force of her fall. Crack! Crash! Pa! Because the speed was too fast, Ning Xuemo heard the sound of countless branches breaking the moment she was hugged. Then, with a thud, she was smashed into a pile of withered leaves. The leaves around her danced wildly. Ning Xuemo's forehead heavily knocked against an ice-cold object, causing her head to ring and stars to appear in front of her eyes. She shook her head. After the stars scattered, she finally found herself in someone's arms. In front of her was the enlarged white jade mask of the ancestor. In other words, the ancestor was her meat cushion. Under the white jade mask, his black jade-like eyes were slightly closed. He lay there motionless. Damn it! He wouldn't be knocked unconscious, would he? Ning Xuemo scrambled to get up from his body. Di Zun had protected her very well. Apart from her head hitting the Di Zun's mask, she didn't hit anything else. Her arms and legs were still as nimble as before. The first thing she did after jumping up was to check on the ancestor. He lay there, with countless withered leaves beneath him. Countless withered leaves had also fallen onto his loose white robes. He did not move at all, as if he had really fainted. It can't be. He was the omnipotent, venerable sovereign. Falling off a cliff could knock him out. Wasn't this too fantastical? Or was this one of his methods? One couldn't blame Ning Xuemo for thinking this way. In her mind, the ancestor was too powerful. Moreover, she had indeed suffered a few hidden losses, so she subconsciously guarded against him. Sovereign? Di Zun. Ning Xuemo squatted beside him and gently patted his arm. The ancestor's eyes were still closed, and he didn't move. Ning Xuemo didn't give up. She called him several times, but he still didn't move. Even his eyelashes didn't move. Wasn't he completely dizzy? He was pretending. He must be pretending. She didn't believe that such a godlike person could faint from falling. If this spread out, no one would believe it. She also didn't believe it. Maybe this was another one of his methods. Ning Xuemo stood up. Ancestor, are you just lying down here to rest? Or do you want to borrow some earth energy? Chapter 738. Okay, then Xuemo won't disturb you for the time being. I'll go ahead and check the road first. Ning Xuemo said as she walked. She had already seen that she had fallen into a forest. The other forests were basically a mix of trees, with all kinds of tree species, tall and short. Strangely, there was only one tree here. The trunk of this kind of big tree was iron gray in color. Because all the leaves had fallen, the branches were like thick and thin iron bars, malevolent like the claws of a demon, reaching into the air. There were cracks on the trunk of the main tree. Upon closer inspection, those cracks looked like the facial features of an ugly person. At first glance, it looked like a ghost's face was grinning at people. Although Ning Xuemo was bold, she was still shocked by the ghost's face on the tree. She clenched her fingers. Looking up, there were undulating clouds above her head. She had clearly fallen from the mountain peak, but she couldn't see any shadow of the mountain in this dense forest. It was as if she had fallen from a high place out of thin air. It was obviously the beginning of winter. The leaves on the big trees had all fallen, and the cold wind was blowing. Logically speaking, the forest should be very dry. However, she smelled a damp smell. The smell of the withered leaves seemed to be mixed with other smells. Ning Xuemore sniffed, but she couldn't smell what it was. She looked around again. Reflected in her eyes were the big trees that looked like ghost faces. It was obviously daytime, but the sun couldn't be seen here. However, the light was still very bright. Such a bright place gave people a kind of gloomy and cold air, which made people feel cold. It was a very strange place. She didn't expect that there would be such an evil place under the holy white tower. She turned her head to look at Di Zun. Di Zun, who was always obsessed with cleanliness, was still lying there pretending to be unconscious. What kind of trick was he playing? Such a question flashed through Ning Xuemore's mind. She had a very strange feeling about Di Zun. He had saved her time and time again. Obviously, she could rely on him, but subconsciously, she was always on guard against him. Even Xuemore herself didn't know what was going on with this kind of mentality. Furthermore, she had been preoccupied with practicing martial arts recently, so she was too lazy to analyze these trivial matters. Therefore, after deducing that the Almighty couldn't have fainted from falling off a cliff, she assumed that his current actions were intentional. As for why the ancestor had pretended to faint, she couldn't figure it out at the moment. Anyway, don't try to guess the Almighty's thoughts. You won't understand no matter how hard you try. Because of this, Ning Xuemore simply stopped caring about him. The Almighty was lying there pretending to be unconscious. Seeing that she wasn't fooled, he would probably get up soon. She didn't need to worry too much. Ancestor, you can rest here. I'll go ahead and explore the path. She didn't care if he could hear her or not. After saying this, she turned around and went ahead to explore the path. There was no path in the dense forest. There were only dense weeds under their feet. Occasionally, there would be long snakes, centipedes, and other creatures crawling under their feet. These trees looked a little strange, but there didn't seem to be any danger in this dense forest. Ning Xuemore breathed a sigh of relief. This was the ancestor's territory, so how could there be anything evil here? She walked forward for a while, but the surrounding scenery was still the same. There was no change. Ning Xuemore looked back again. Standing at her position, she couldn't see the ancestor's shadow. He didn't chase after her. Was he meditating in the same place? You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.